Over on my Patreon, I am posting every other day this week and next some exclusive stories, so if that interests you, feel free to check it out. When I was 12, I can still remember this event vividly. Mum had caught me up playing video games at night for 2 nights before, when the computer was in the kitchen. I was set up so that if you turned to the right you would see the door to the kitchen. I was messaging some friends online when I see someone from the corner of my eye. I scoot back already, prepping to get yelled at to try and explain why I was up at 3 a.m. again, except when I turned, I wasn't looking at my mum. I was looking at a much older woman with soft eyes and short curly hair. I remember freezing, and the chills of fear as I realized what I was looking at. She was white, pure white overall. She looked at me, looked around the kitchen, and then smiled sweetly before turning and sort of dissolving into the air. I stayed in my chair staring slack-jawed for 5 minutes before I worked up the guts to turn on the light. No one was there. All the doors were locked. She hadn't made a noise, and I went back to message my friend that I just saw a ghost, and she went, "Lol, okay, sure." I was wide awake, and I know what I saw, but it still boggles my mind. My parents had me when they were in their early 20s, and they did not have their own place yet. When I was 4, they got married and we moved into our own house, but before that, I lived with my mum and grandparents at her house. Since I was very young, I used to sleep in the master bedroom, in a big bed sandwich between my mum and grandma. My grandpa used to sleep in the spare room. I'm not sure why grandma slept with us. My grandparents had a great relationship, but anyway. I vividly remember an elderly woman with curly red hair and a green dress talking to me every night. She would appear after my mum turned off all the lights and told me to sleep. This lady used to tell me to be quiet and to not make too much noise because my grandma and mum were very tired and needed their sleep so that they could take care of me tomorrow. She was always nice to me. She kept me in check and made sure I didn't annoy my mum or nan or woke them up. Sometimes she would sing to me. I was always in my own little world when she was talking to me, like she demanded all of my attention. My mum confirms that I used to tell her that I saw the woman with red hair again last night. She was a bit freaked out, but she assumed it was my own imagination, and when I grew up and still visited my grandmother, I stopped seeing her. I lived with my grandma for a few months after my grandpa died, and nothing unusual happened. But at age 16, I was doing my A-levels, and one time my mum came with me to the A-level art to make sure I wouldn't get lost finding the school it was going to be held in. There was this other girl who had been in my secondary school doing the same exam, and her father had driven her there. My mum and her dad recognized each other and were doing small talk. She was asking him where they lived. He told her that he lived in the same village my grandma lives in, and my mum told him the specific block of flats, as he lived nearby. He told her that people say they see a woman with curly red hair there, and paranormal stuff happens frequently. The description matched the one of the lady I used to see as a kid, and that really freaked me out for a long while. I'm a skeptic paranormal investigator, and I've had a lot of experiences, most which can be rationally explained away. However, I've had 2 outstanding experiences, about 14 years apart. The first was in the year 2000. I lived in a house that was, for lack of a better term, haunted. Lots of things went on there, but it was the night I saw and heard a full-bodied apparition walk down the stairs in front of me and a friend. It got to the bathroom, turned, walked right past us and disappeared as it went into our living room. I've never seen anything like that before. It was one of those things where you have plenty of time to say to yourself, is this really happening? And in that moment, all the stories I heard seemed to culminate in this reality. I thought, oh my God, this is what they were talking about. The second was in 2014. I was at one of our regular stops called the Shanley Hotel. I've stayed there with the investigation team several times, but on Halloween night I woke up to the sound of a woman positively sobbing on the other side of my bedroom wall. It was coming from an area that used to be a catwalk that was now sealed. It was 3:35 in the morning, and it went on for 4 minutes but felt like an eternity. Of course I couldn't sleep after that, and it wasn't over. About 45 minutes later the activity continued, when I clearly heard a man and woman talking right in my room, followed by the sound of various people stopping and running around outside my bedroom door and saying, "Hey." I checked out the entire area, and there was no evidence of trickery. We knew the place inside and out, but had access to the entire building. I considered every possible way it could have been a trick, but it just didn't make sense. I think a lot of people get carried away and blow their experiences out of proportion. I've had plenty of my own that I couldn't really make a big deal about, but those two experiences have always been with me, and I think about them often. My dad passed away at the ripe age of 99. My dad had always been a penny guy and would always pick them up. He lived through the Great Depression and his family had always been poor. Anyway, he never believed in wasting money. The day after his funeral, I was in my room with my son looking at some photos. A penny fell off the dresser and rolled across the floor. Not sure what knocked it off, but I jokingly told my son, "Well, I guess your granddaddy's letting us know that he made it." We laughed it off, but after that we began finding pennies every day. Every time one of us would pick it up, laugh and say, "Guess granddaddy was here today." The following year my son turned 21. He was working that day at Six Flags over Texas as a train engineer on their 2 antique steam locomotives. At the end of his shift he drove home and found me getting ready to go out for his birthday party dinner. He said, "Mum, you know how we always joke about Granddaddy leaving those pennies?" I said, "Sure. I just found one earlier today." He asks me to hold out my hand, and into it he puts a handful of pennies. He then said, "Count them," which I did. There were exactly 21 pennies. He said, "I found these on the last run I made to the train today." Ghost or odd coincidence? Doesn't really matter to me. But it made my son happy, and that made me feel great. Maybe my dad really was reaching out to say happy birthday to his only grandson. I was finishing packing up the downstairs rooms. A little backstory. My mother-in-law can no longer live by herself and she came to live with us in February. Since then I have been going to her house to clear it and pack stuff up. First thing to know is that she's a hoarder. We have previously cleaned the house no less than 4 times. It's huge. We can fit 4.5 of our houses in hers. It needs major repairs and remodeling. Then we are all moving in. So it's been stressful. I'm the one usually taking care of her house. However, in the garage, it's under the house, there's a little room and it gives me the biggest creeps. I had a previous experience where an entity picked up a cord and dangled it in front of me, sort of saying like, "Hey, I'm here, you know, and I know." In the upstairs we hear bangs and knocks, and you can feel someone watching you. This time I was finishing the last 2 rooms in the basement. They're furnished rooms, and there's 3 of them. I finished putting things in boxes to donate and bagging garbage. These rooms lead to the garage. I had gone to put the donation boxes in the garage and got the biggest chill up the back of my neck. Now I have been in and out of there most of the day and nothing like this has ever happened, so I nope the hell out of there in the garage and close and lock the door. As I get out to the game room I hear the doorbell, which doesn't work, and I ignore it because I want to get stuff done. Finally I go to the room closest to the front door and look up to see who's there. There's no one except Donna the cat looking down at me. It's a stray because the windows are high up. I can see the door and the doorbell is still ringing. I walk to the last room that leads upstairs and I'm standing next to the doorway deciding my next move, when all of a sudden a white figure walks past me in the game room. It was a male. Just everything a filmy white. It scared the pee-poo out of me. It took me by surprise. It didn't feel evil. It just strolled on past. I don't think it was the garage thing. It had a different feel. I didn't leave, but I wonder what other spirit will show itself now. I did finish my work and left the boxes and baggie for the husband to deal with though. This is one of my buddy's stories. We were at a brewery with some friends and our spouses, and I asked him a question about his ex. Someone made a joke because I dated his ex at one point in high school. I don't regret it really, but it was a dumb decision because it did hurt our friendship at the time. Anyway, I remember sitting in the couch with her, and she told me that when she was a kid she had an imaginary friend she could legitimately see. Her name was Emily, and she had very long black hair. She told me she had a friend over who claimed to be able to see paranormal things, and claimed to see Emily. So while we were talking about that, I asked him if he'd ever seen Emily or heard her being spoken about. I mean, him and his ex dated for years. He took a big gulp of his sour drink. Yeah, man. I know you remember how her room was laid out and all. Well, I was staying the night at her house and I woke up, and she was sitting there in the mirror brushing her hair. I'm thinking, damn, it's awfully late to be brushing your hair, but I just rolled over into the bed, and as I looked, she was there sleeping next to me. I rolled back over, and no one was in the mirror. That's when I realized it was Emily. My parents split up when I was a kid, and I went to my father's new home when I was something like 15. I'm 30 now. This house had quite a story, and my father as well. I don't really know if there's an equivalent in English, but there was a magnesteur, a healer. To be honest, I grew up with a lot of doubts about his gift, but he actually helped a lot of people, so I went along with it. He claimed several times he had the capacity to sense the souls around him. He would also talk about his guides. He was a believer, a lot more than I. I generally think most stories are interesting, but probably nonsense. Anyway, he brought the house. That was almost in ruins. He brought it from a friend of the village he was in, as we grew up in the countryside of France in the Berry. It was a particularly renowned village, because many artists and potters lived there. It was a big business. Well, apparently the previous owner was a potter too, but an eccentric one. He made an entire wall on the house with clay pots mounted on it. I heard he was buried in this village, and he eventually killed himself in this very house. His spouse didn't want to sell it to any other potters because she thought that they were responsible for his death, so she sold it to my father. When I came in the first time, I just felt like being in an old country house without anything special. The stone floor was cold, there was a big wood stove, and my father made a mezzanine in front of his bedroom. It was a house for one person, with a living room mixed with the kitchen, a bathroom on the east, and his waiting room, or consultation room for his healing sessions on the west, and just the bedroom upstairs with the mezzanine that I would sleep in. We spent a few hours in the living room first. I was walking a bit, and at some point I thought I saw something by the window. It was just in the corner of my eye, but I was sure I saw something. I went to see what it was, and my father just said, "Oh, you saw him too?" Then he told me about the guy and his story. He told me several other experiences. One especially stuck with me. When he was taking the measures to install the new windows, he heard something telling him, "Tu t'es trompé," as in, you made a mistake. He quickly dismissed it, and thought that it had just been in his head. Then he went to order his windows, and indeed there was a mistake. He had other experiences like things falling, voices, or generally the feeling that he wasn't alone, but I guess it's not exactly the most authentic proof. A few weeks later, I went to sleep on his mezzanine. Actually, I couldn't sleep because my father, in his bedroom, snores like a bear. It was like 2 a.m., and not being able to sleep at all when I heard something downstairs. The front door opened, while I knew it was locked. At first I felt scared, but mostly because I thought someone was housebreaking. But then, when I heard something, I became even more frightened. There were footsteps. It sounded like they were barefoot. I could tell someone was walking downstairs, dragging their feet. So at some point I had to verify, and I slowly walked to the stairs and stuck my head out to see if there was anyone there. And I saw a foot out of the shadow, a pale, naked foot in front of the first step. I was completely petrified. I don't know how long I saw it for, but at some point it turned back, and I quickly went to bed. I heard the steps again, but I didn't hear the door this time. A few hours later, I managed to have the courage to dress and go downstairs. The door was closed, the wood stove was off, and the living room was extremely cold. And just when I went to verify if the door was locked, I heard more steps, so I ran upstairs again. The next morning I told my father about it, and he just laughed. "Yeah, he comes visiting sometimes, he's probably just testing you." My father thinks I also have gifts like him, but I honestly don't believe it, at least I don't want to. I know I was completely sober when I experienced that night. It just made me think a lot about it. Anyway, my father still lives in the house, but apparently he doesn't have much more paranormal activity than that. He says the previous owner probably got bored and moved on. Occasionally when he tells the story, I think the guy was probably really bored that time I saw him. In any case, let's not meet again, spooky ghost. A few friends and I share a really big old Victorian-era house. During the first lockdown of the pandemic, I was the only housemate not working from home, meaning that in the mornings I'd be the only person up and about. One morning I walk downstairs and see the back door is wide open, and one of my other housemates is outside tidying up the garden. I saw him from the back, but I could be certain it was Andrew. I thought nothing of it, as he mentioned that he was returning to his office for a few days a week, as restrictions eased, and figured that it was why he was dressed quite smartly. White shirt, black trousers and shoes. Why he'd be tidying up the garden before he left for work, I will never know, but my housemates being the people that they are, I was guessing he got drunk and trashed the place the night before and perhaps felt guilty about it. I made myself a tea and turned to leave the kitchen, not really looking up, and noticed in my peripheral vision him pass the kitchen doorway down the hall. When I turned into the hallway, however, a second later he was nowhere to be seen. A little strange, but it was early, so I thought nothing of it. The day continued and all was well. Later that night, when we were all hanging out, I asked Andrew about why he was tidying up the garden in the morning, and he hadn't a clue what I was talking about. He said to me that he had been into his office and didn't get up until long after I'd left. Then I mentioned that I saw him wearing a white shirt and smart trousers, and he freaked out a little bit, and confessed to me that he'd been keeping quiet about something he'd seen in the house, as he thought we'd take the piss out of him. According to him, he spotted a man exactly as I described standing in the living room as he passed by the door one night, but when he double-checked to see what he'd seen, the man was gone. Literally nothing else has happened in the house since. So, maybe perhaps a bit of a boring story, but I finally have a ghost story to share, so that's nice. My mum told me this story when I was younger, but now refuses to talk about it. This was before I was born. My sister was a newborn at the time, and my mum stayed home for a while after maternity leave while my dad worked. She was new to Canada and eager to make friends and eventually get to know our neighbours. One had a 7-year-old girl. My mum would often visit and invite her over for ice cream, to the point it became a reoccurring thing after school. Unfortunately, the kid got into an accident and passed away. Time kind of passed until one day my mum heard the door knock. She peeked through the door hole and shockingly saw the little girl. Out of panic, she kind of stumbled backwards with no words coming out of her mouth. Frozen, the little girl asks if she can come in for ice cream. My mum claims she told the little girl to go away, and she wasn't real. The girl persisted, this time knocking harder on the door. The knocks got harder and harder, eventually turning into thundering smashes. The door frame was shaking, and the door itself looked like it was about to split down the middle. Then suddenly everything stopped. It's dead quiet, and everything is calm and motionless. That's when my mum claims she heard the most evil, roaring, and terrifying voice belt out from behind the door, "Let me in." My biological dad lives in a creepy old farmhouse he renovated. I was helping him build out the office late one night. He went to the bathroom and I kept plunking away. I was on the floor and set my hammer down. and I felt something, a presence, and looked to where I thought someone would be, but there was nothing. I reached back down for my hammer, and it's out of arm's reach, maybe 5 feet further than where I had set it down. I hadn't moved it at all. He comes back after he's finished, and I tell him what just happened. He laughs and says, "Ha, the little girl must be playing with you." Little girl, what? He tells me every now and then he hears a little girl laughing and has even seen her. She's always wearing the same pair of overalls, and she just kind of wanders around upstairs. I'm not one to believe in the paranormal, but I have no explanation other than a little ghost girl just wanted to play. When I was a teenager, I had to study weeks before exams, so when I was home alone, I was sitting in my room, door open, so that the cat could come and go as it pleased. I was studying in silence, and after a while I became aware of sounds downstairs, and it sounded like someone was walking around down there. Not footsteps, but the swishing of clothing. All the windows in the house were shut, so I thought that maybe the maid had popped in for some reason. She had a key and lived across the road, so I went down to investigate, and no one was there, and the noises had stopped. I walked through the entire downstairs of our house, as it wasn't very big and it didn't take very long. Eventually, I was standing at the bottom of the stairs about to walk back up to my room, when I heard the same swishing sound again, but now it was upstairs. So, repeat, and I looked upstairs and no one. Again I could hear movement downstairs. As I walked up and down all over the house multiple times, I could not find what made the noise. A few years later, my brother was the one studying at home, and the exact same thing happened to him. According to my girlfriend, who has a really hard time believing in anything supernatural, her sister has been haunted since she was a child. Everything from seeing a small child run in front of the TV, multiple people seeing the same tall man lurking in the dark, to a light bulb exploding in her bedroom and the door slamming and locking itself. The light in that room stopped working, and every electrician they hired couldn't figure out what was wrong. At the time of this story, they were in the process of moving out of the house and had no furniture left in it. Fortunately for my curiosity and the relevance of this story, she was also in the room. At this point, only me and one other person who I thoroughly trusted were in this room, holding a Ouija board, specifically the planchette, and I trusted them enough not to move it. So I asked if there was anything following her that might want to speak. My girlfriend's sister freaked out for a second and made it very clear that she did not want to be a part of this at all, but then the planchette moved to yes. We asked it a few more questions. Will you speak to us? Will you stay with us if she leaves the room? No. How old are you? 9. The question was very confusing because according to every person in the family, they'd all seen a very tall man. Does that mean she was 9 when you started following her? Yes, it replied. At this point, she noped out the room. The moment she stepped out, the planchette straight moved to goodbye, and we couldn't speak to it anymore. But then I had a great idea. Let's take the Ouija board to her house and try it there. We convinced that poor girl to come with us on the condition that she would be able to put in her headphones and drown out whatever we were saying. She didn't want to have anything to do with it. We arrived at the house and set up the board on a small island counter in the kitchen. We waited to turn the lights off, so she retreated to the kitchen pantry with another person and turned the lights on in there. Can we speak to the entity we spoke with at the last house? Yes. Are you the same entity following her around? Yes. At this point I wanted proof. I wanted something solid that I could take away from this experience and say without a doubt that there is something beyond our understanding and point to this as proof, at least to myself. Will you move something in this room? No. Will you move something if I am the only one in this room? No. Will you move something if she was the only one here? Yes. Then I had an idea. It was crucial that nobody in the pantry hear what I was about to say, so I say it very quietly. Could you shut the pantry light off?
There was a very uncomfortable silence as the other people around me waited to see what would happen. The planchette began to move to yes, but it dragged off the board and towards the pantry. There was a loud slam in the pantry. The lights went out, and everyone inside screamed and fell out. The next moment was one of panic, confusion, and, at least for me, achievement. Whatever the hell had just happened in that pantry was exactly what I had been looking for. Something real that I could point to and say, "This is how I know." After the two had caught their breath, they both told me that there was a wooden board on the top shelf leaning against the wall. According to them, the board flipped out of the wall and slammed the shelf, flipping onto the floor. If I remember correctly, it hit one of them and left a bruise. They weren't sure how the lights went out. One possibility is that in a panic to leave the room, one of them bumped against the light switch, but the moment had been too chaotic to really tell beyond a doubt why the lights switched off. 70% of the group was ready to nope out, but there were a few of us, including myself, that wanted to bring the board into the room that had the most activity. It was the same room with that light bulb that had exploded, the same room that the dogs would never go near, and the same room that children would avoid looking at when they passed. Me and two others decided to use the board there. Upon walking into the room, it felt like a heavy blanket had been laid upon me. It felt like the sinking feeling when the love of your life tells you to piss off. It was almost hard to breathe, like when your bathroom fills up with steam, except it was very cold. Me and the other two sat down and started asking questions, except there was something very different. Before, the planchette had been moving slowly and deliberately across the board, but now it was moving so fast that it would almost fly off the board. In fact, at one point, it slipped out from under my fingers and kept going. The last question we asked is what its name was. It began to spell out G-O-D, and at this point, two other people noped out and left the board immediately. I told it we had to go and moved it to goodbye. When we left the room, we found out that the other girl that had been in the pantry had to leave the house and was throwing up outside. When I asked her why, she said that the air had felt so heavy that she began getting nauseous. This experience was, without a doubt, the most terrifying and exhilarating of my life. It was exactly what I was looking for and more. However, one thing stuck with me that is more terrifying than anything else, even the slamming board in the pantry, the implications of which still send a wave of terror down my back at every thought. Just before I left the room, I asked if it would be willing to stay with me if she went home. It said yes.
Saturday 8th, 2021, May, 6:45 p.m. I used to work in a large warehouse that didn't have many people in it on Saturdays and Sundays, after the daytime people leave, which happened sometime between 4 and 5. By not many people, I mean none. Well, none in my massive section of the building, since there wasn't a whole lot to do. I hid in the back corner where the cameras couldn't see me and just dicked around until the last half hour of my shift, when I actually had something to do. When it's windy, the walls will sometimes creak and groan against their support. I had been hiding in this corner for quite a number of weekends, so had gotten used to the noises. Then from the back wall that runs perpendicular to the aisle, I heard a loud woman's sigh. Not a lot of women work here, but I brushed it off as being the wind acting funny on the walls. Again, even though I've literally never heard anything like that before, it was 6:45. Then an hour later, I was still there in the corner, reading a creepy-ass Reddit thread, when from a few slots into the aisle directly in front of me came, "Oh, hello," in the exact same voice, but there was no one there. If there was, not only would I have seen them coming from quite a way away, but they would have tripped on the motion sensor light, and everything would have been illuminated around me. My first thought was that it was the wind, but it wasn't windy, Besides, I would have heard the usual creaks and groans in tandem with it. I'm also pretty sure the wall wasn't going to sound like a woman's voice, especially in two separate spots. The thing is, directly in front of me was metal racking. From where I was only likely to be noticed once someone started walking down that aisle and got near the end, which was where the voice came from. She sounded surprised, as though she wasn't expecting anyone to be there, and though she had the warehouse to herself. I tried to gain the courage to say something, but couldn't, because the thought of hearing a response weirded me out too much. I wasn't as scared as I was startled. I wanted to talk to her, but just really wasn't mentally ready for it. What if I tried to say something to her and she responded? Would I be mentally ready to handle that? Then a few minutes later, I heard her further down the aisle. 3 more syllables, but no idea what she said. She was walking away from me. Well, screw you then, I rather humorously thought to myself. I couldn't quite will myself to sit back down and go back to Reddit, so I hung around for a bit and eventually left 20 minutes later. I don't think the warehouse is haunted, though various people have seen and heard various things over time. From their accounts, I'm sure there are different entities, but they wander the area and only show up in the warehouse when it's empty. Most encounters happen near the holidays, so it wasn't unusual in that regard. I continued to sit in that corner every Saturday and Sunday for the remainder of my time I worked there, and I never heard anything again, which was a little bit disappointing. When I was in college and studying at home, I remember needing to find a particularly old 17th century play called The Alchemist by Ben Jonson. Me being poor and stupid, I didn't buy the class textbook, so I had to find it on my own. I was at my desk, and behind me was a walk-in closet, which I used as a library, as I collected old and rare books. I remember thinking that I saw the play in an old anthology of literature that I owned, and quickly pushed that out of my mind, as I thought it would take too much effort for a text that was surely available on Project Gutenberg online. I hear a loud thump behind me, and turn around in my chair and walk into the closet, and on the floor was a book turned open, with the pages facing up. You have to understand this part for it to truly sink in, that my closet was lined with shelves that extended far enough back that no part of my books were hanging over the edge. I was meticulous and very careful with them, as some were relics. I looked at the book in disbelief, and when I saw that it was the anthology of literature I was thinking of, and not only that, but the header of the page showed it was a page of the play The Alchemist, I knew this was something truly out of the ordinary and unexplainable. I have more experiences in this house, but one thing will remain with me as irrefutable proof that something intelligent understood my inner thoughts and caused that to happen. In the same house, on the day my father died, my grandma also tells a story of how pictures in the house were flying off the walls at her. My dad hated her guts, and she's always been an honest person. I don't know if I'd call what happened to me an experience with a ghost per se, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. Every month, on the 5th, since I moved into this house, I always hear someone screaming, "Let me in a distorted voice outside my door. I've lived here for 5 years. I know these patterns. It manifests every 5th of the month. When it appears, you can smell it before you hear it, since it smells like smoke, garlic, and at first, I thought the stove was on, and it was burning. But in my exhaustion, told myself it was a fire, and I bought my deer killer just in case. And when I was about to open the door, I hear banging and screaming and a man saying, "Let me in." And that's when I jumped to my senses and found my compact ladder and hopped out the window. This persisted for a while, and it always stays in the range of 11-12 p.m. to 4 a.m. This happened for 3 months, and I thought a psycho was in my house, and I had it searched multiple times by the police. Me and my boys, the police, found nothing. So I installed the security system, and once again, when I reviewed the footage, it had been like it had never been recorded. It skipped the second it started. I wish I knew what was going on here. This happened around 4 years ago, in a house where I lived with my mum and brother. My mum and brother still lived there. An old couple died in this house before we moved in. There is a small basement which me and my dad decorated, so it's my extra room. The basement has a separate door from the outside. One day, I was chilling in the basement with my friend watching some movies. We were home alone. My mum was at work until 8 p.m. We told her to bring us some snacks, and when she returned it was 8:15. When we heard the main door of the house opening and steps going from the living room to the kitchen, and chairs moving, the normal noises you'll hear when someone is upstairs. We both heard it, and I was like, "My mum came home." And he said, "Yeah, I hear it, snacks are here." A few minutes later my phone rings. It's my mum, and I was like, "Okay, probably she's calling so that we can come and get the snacks." I answer, and she says, "I'm stuck at work, probably be home at 10, problems with security." I was speechless. I looked at my friend and he was shaking. He heard my mum through the phone. I had one key to the house, my mum had the other. My brother was at my grandparents' place, no one else had a key and there were only two. So we went upstairs to the main door. It was locked. The lights were out. I opened and we searched the house. Nothing. That's weird. We just left it as it was. There were no chairs moved, even though we both heard them moving, and it still gives me chills even thinking about it. I heard a lot of steps and movement upstairs when I was alone in the basement, but didn't think much of it since only I heard it. But as my friend heard it too, I'm starting to think that everything else I heard was also true, and not just a figment of my imagination. As a kid, I used to be pretty scared of aliens or ghosts or whatever, but I grew up in San Diego and moved to Las Vegas. I went back to visit, and the job I had at the time was at Starwood Hotels, so they had a lot of super cheap employee rates and around the world, and one of those was for the US Grant in downtown San Diego. And the hotel is super nice for $59 a night. And one morning, very early, I hear a seriously demonic voice, but I'm pretty groggy, my eyes are closed, somewhere between waking and sleeping, and I kind of ignore it, but then I wake up, and had remembered that voice right away. Then there were some oddities that happened as I awoke, like literally articles of clothing I had just taken off the bedside, and a pillow were miraculously and by themselves in the bathroom, so it's not like, oh, I must have left them there. And how was that pillow there? It was just on the bed. So I sort of dismissed it all, but with the demonic voice in my mind. So then I go to dinner with my friends, and I'm telling them all of this, when we all look up on our phones haunted places in San Diego, and the US Grant shows up and reads, "It's not unusual for housekeeping staff to report their cleaning supplies moved while tending to other things in different guest rooms. Some guests have claimed they've seen the ghost of a man standing over them while they're in bed. The man is reportedly heavy-set, dons a black suit, and quickly appears and then vanishes. Problems with light flickerings are frequently reported, as well as hearing random footsteps and other obscure noises." Well, maybe it was paranormal after all. Myself and a few friends went for a drive at night and parked on a country road just outside of town, right near a small bridge. We were just chatting away and hanging out in the car looking at the window, and I remember one of us pointing and saying, "Shh, be quiet. Do you hear that?" We all went silent and immediately heard what sounded like a crying woman. This freaked me out, and of course everyone was freaking out too in the car. I remember we were just looking everywhere outside the car to try and see something, but none of us could see anything. Then we all heard and felt what seemed like the bottom of the car being scratched. That combined with the crying. Yeah, panic ensued. True story. Also, fun note, That car was probably the fastest a car has ever gone in reverse.
My teacher thought it was only appropriate to tell us a story about his paranormal experiences. One of them that really stuck to me was a story he was telling us about his farm his family has always lived on. He said that 8 years ago, after class was over and he'd finished his tales, one of his students came up to him and asked how his grandfather died. He told Becky that it was kidney failure. Becky said that that's what she'd suspected. Then Becky started asking about the grandfather's appearance. Did he wear overalls, have really long grey hair and facial hair, and wear glasses? At this point, the teacher is a bit creeped out and asks why she wants to know. Her response? Oh, because as you were telling the story about your grandpa, I saw him standing in the corner of the room. He wants you to call your grandma. This story happened to my friend's dad, and he isn't the guy to make stuff up, so I 100% believe him. My friend's dad, Jack, and his brother Tom lived with each other in the 80s. It was just the two of them living in the house and no one else. So this one night, Jack is coming home at night and walks into the living room to see a bunch of old people sitting around talking. As he walks in, they all quiet down and awkwardly look at him as he walks by. He doesn't see Tom anywhere, so he just assumes Tom will be back to tend to his guests. Jack has work the next morning, so he goes into his room to get some sleep, but is kept up from all the people talking. He walks out of the room and is promptly met up with Tom, who was coming out of his room to tell Jack to keep his friends quiet. However, Jack was coming out to tell Tom to keep his friends quiet. They walk out from the hallway into the living room, only to see it's empty, with the leftover smell of musk lingering in the air.
I was on my way home from a 12-day vacation, driving a pickup pulling a fifth-wheel RV. It was about 11 p.m. on a Saturday night in late July, and I was about 2 hours from home, trying to make it home yet that night. I was in a very rural area where there was almost no one living on about a 20-mile stretch of road. There was only one combination gas station / tavern / motel, and it's heavily wooded on both sides. It's a county maintained and fenced at the tree line. The shallow ditches had been mowed, and the grass was about 6 inches high. I only saw a couple of cars on this whole stretch. I was going about 50 because it was heavily populated with deer. I saw movement ahead, so I immediately slowed down. As I passed, I saw a young woman, tall, fit brunette, wearing a cropped top, pleated skirt and stockings, walking with traffic just off the shoulder. I immediately thought she had car trouble, though I had not passed a car that had broken down. Or perhaps it was a fight with her boyfriend. I pulled to the side of the road, hit the emergency flashes and grabbed the flashlight to check on her. When I got to the rear of the camper, no one was there. I looked around for her. There was no way she could have reached the back of the RV before I did. So she could not have been hiding there. She could not have hidden the ditches as the grass was too short, and she could not have made it all over the fence without a light. In the little time it took me to get the rear of the RV, I looked out where she'd been walking and saw no signs that the dew on the grass had been disturbed. I drove the rest of the way home, with the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. When me and my sister used to share a bunk bed, we both saw dark figures looking at us through a window on the second floor of the house. And unless some guy had a ladder and was trying to break into our house, I'm convinced it was a ghost. Whenever I'd walk or drive past a cemetery, weird stuff would happen to me later that day. It was almost as if something followed me home. And my basement had a door in it with glass panels that led to nowhere. It used to lead to an underground tunnel that connected the house across the alley, but it was filled in years ago. One time I abruptly woke up and saw a face looking at me through one of the glass panels, and sometimes I see weird lights coming through. and there are no lights. Recently I was sleeping down there due to hot weather and having no AC in my room, and I dreamt that I was in there being watched in my sleep. I was only 6 to 8 years old, and I was on my way home after having lunch with my grandparents and mother. We share half of the same house, so I asked my mum if I could go back home. So I left and went inside my house, opened the door and walked a bit. When I reached the diner/living room, I saw a child about my size and same age, but looked completely different. White, like the old pictures that were in black and white. She used some kind of really old-looking dress, almost Victorian children's style. Her hair looked really curly in pigtails. I stared at the kid, feeling like I was watching something that really shouldn't or wasn't there. After I saw her, I took off running to the other side of the house where my grandparents and mother were. I remember that I was crying to them about some random kid in the house, and the kid looked like she had some old and glowing white skin complexion. My mum never really believed me, until she recalled that when we moved into the house I told her that some kid always looked at me from under my bedroom door. So she said to just ask what she wants, and I told her that the kid told me that she wanted to protect me. There's always the explanation of an overactive imagination, but I don't recall that ever happening, and remember these events quite vividly. My house has an open kitchen and living room. The front door is facing the kitchen. As I was walking in, I saw what I thought was my roommate's boyfriend ducking down behind the kitchen counter, doing something to spook me that didn't seem too unusual for him as he's a bit of a prankster. So I laughed and said something like, "Nice try, I saw you duck down." After a moment of silence, a super weird feeling washed over me, and I quickly walked over the kitchen and past the counter to see that no one was there. I walked down into the basement, and him and my roommate were down there watching a movie. The spot I saw this figure duck down was the furthest spot in the room from any door, so it wouldn't have been possible for him to duck down and then sneak out of the room, because he would have to go past the counter right to where I was standing to do so. This isn't the first spooky thing I've experienced in my house. Hearing glass shattering inside with no known source, stuff falling off walls, appliances acting weird. My husband has seen dark figures, but none of this was in our current home. This is the only house I lived in recently that I actually feel not creeped out in, like I can go out to the kitchen in the middle of the night for water and not even turn lights on. But I still often think of this person I saw ducking down to hide. This happened in 2011. Me and my older brother were playing hide and seek, and my old house had a very long hallway that had rooms to a laundry room, a bathroom, and me and my brother's bedrooms. Anyway, we were playing and I looked into the hallway, and all the way back into the laundry room I saw half of a dark figure with long black hair and face paint, and as soon as it turned to look at me, it slowly went back into the laundry room, and so I investigated and saw nothing in there. My dad believes our house was haunted by Native Americans because the land we live on was close to a reservation. Plus, my dad and older brother also experienced paranormal stuff as well. Like one time, my grandma was sleeping in our house when she woke up and saw a hand floating, reaching for her, and she yelled out, "El Diablo!" or something like that. But my uncle told me that she believed that she was connected to the other world. My uncle also told me that our old house gave him a weird feeling. Also, we moved from that house in 2014, but in June of 2021, I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, and right when I was about to put soap on my arm, I looked as I felt a burning sensation, and I saw 3 scratch marks that were red slowly appear from nothing. I freaked out and told my sister. Whenever me and my siblings are home alone downstairs, we hear footsteps pacing back and forth up the stairs. Whenever we go on our stairway, the footsteps stop abruptly. Also, sometimes when we get home from vacation to find one or two of our windows open. As we live in a safe neighborhood, this isn't really a problem, but my mom is convinced that it's the work of ghosts, because we would obviously never leave our windows open before going on road trips. Our attic is far too small and dangerous for a stowaway. Plus, the only entrance to it is in my mum's closet, which has boxes and stuff, and is impenetrable to get through without making a ton of noise or being extremely obvious. We also have 4 cats and dogs, so no human or vermin are running around in our house undetected. The footsteps are loud stomps that pace back and forth and aren't human, but stop abruptly when I reach the stairs. It's not like something scuttles away and hides. It simply stops. My boyfriend and I were in our house eating dinner. Our front door was open and the screen door was closed. We heard the screen door open and slam shut. We both went to the living room and out onto the front porch. As soon as we went out, we were hit by a thick, cloying, floral sweet smell. It smelled like funeral flowers, if you've ever smelled that scent before, just overwhelmingly strong and concentrated right in front of our house. We both felt kind of creeped out, so we went back into the house and into our bedroom. I sat on the edge of our bed, which faced the hallway, and one of our dogs came and hopped onto my lap. My boyfriend and I were speculating about what the door slamming and the smell was all about. I was looking straight ahead into the hall during a lull in the conversation, and I saw a dark shadow pass down the hall, go past our bedroom door, and into another room at the end of the hall. It was just tall, vaguely human-shaped and solid black, like the area it was in, just had all the light sucked from it, and you couldn't see through it. Our dog saw it too. He went nuts, barking and growling and whining. For some reason that scared me more than anything, that he saw it too. I started crying and said I wanted to leave the house, so we got our dogs into our car and left. We were having plumbing problems anyway, so we ended up just staying in a hotel room that night. When we came back the next day, things seemed totally normal, and nothing like that happened since. It's definitely been one of the spookiest things I've ever experienced.
I had to take care of my mentally handicapped cousin a few years back. She could get around well enough, but due to severe arthritis in her knees and ankles, she had to be watched and helped into the bath and stuff like that. I would go into her room in the morning, help her to a walker so that she could wee and then make her breakfast. One morning I heard the water running in the bathroom, and I went in to check on her. I had to pass her room on the way to the bathroom, and when I did, I saw that she was in her rocking chair in the corner, her blanket over her head, and she was rocking back and forth. "Don't leave the water on, you're going to flood the place." I went into the bathroom to shut the faucet off, and my cousin was in there washing her face. I immediately ran back into the room, but it was just her blanket crumpled up on the rocking chair. My cousin wanted to know why I undid her bed. I didn't stay long after that. When I was little, maybe 5, I would walk into my parents' bedroom to crawl into bed with them. Many times when walking into their room, I would see a young girl in a white dress standing at the foot of the bed. I would be paralyzed with fear, but being young, I didn't think I understood what I was seeing. I would take agonizing steps forward until I would crawl into bed and then cover myself completely in their blankets. She never moved, spoke, or acknowledged my presence. She was just there. I annoyed a ghost at my old job. I was told the carousel was haunted and didn't believe them. One night, the maintenance door was open and I emptied the ride of guests, and my second insisted they hadn't opened it. I closed it, loaded guests, and it was open again. It has a turn latch that you put a padlock on, so it could only have been opened intentionally. I went inside the center of the carousel, mostly just the breaker and all the mechanical parts are in there, and switched on the light to check for a maintenance guy that hadn't talked to me. It was empty. I'm a little spooked, so I say loudly, I'm not dealing with this crap tonight. I got an hour left to go, so get your act together. In my mum's voice. I do the safety check, start the ride, and the phone rings. When I answer, there's no one on the other end. A few minutes later, it happens again. And after I hang up, I call base to tell them something's wrong with the phone. The supervisor calls back and says sometimes the phone rings randomly and to not worry about it. I recount the tale to a co-worker and she looks at me funny. Did you turn the lights off before the music? No, I need the lights on to get the switch. Oh, well, make sure you never do that, and if the phone rings after, don't answer, just leave. I figure it's some kind of electrical shortage that causes it, and I go home. In the following days, I keep thinking I see it move out the corner of my eye, or hear it running after I've closed for the night, but shake it off. I was working 15-hour days continuously. The next time I opened the carousel, as we took turns, I go take a potty break and come back to the security guard standing next to my ride. I saw him while you were gone. Just be careful, he says to me. What are you talking about? The ride-op, the one that tries to grab operators. I try and think which of my co-workers is that rude. He then goes on to explain that one of the 3 park ghosts is attached to the carousel, and he is the only mean one and tries to grab operators and causes bad luck and rides to malfunction. Apparently I made him mad by yelling at him, and he decided to haunt the hell out of me.
I rented what used to be the master bedroom of a house built around 1970. The current owners made it into a studio with an attached bath and mini kitchen. I lived there for a year on my own before my husband moved in once we were married. Nothing ever happened, but on our wedding day when I woke up, I found a plant that I'd had for many years had somehow flown off my bookshelf and apparently committed suicide in the middle of my floor. There were no earthquakes here, nothing had moved, and it was very strange. Okay, so he moves in and weird stuff starts happening. Like the TV will begin turning on and off by itself. A strong smell of cigarette smoke starts to appear when I'm alone, despite the windows being closed and fans blowing in my face. My husband made a canvas print of one of our wedding pictures, and it kept flying off the wall. I had a tabletop fan that was sitting 6 feet between both my husband and I. I didn't move or shake it, and it was my husband that turned it around to point it at him, as he was quite hot and I was studying with flashcards and didn't want them blowing away. 30 seconds later, I feel the wind blow on me. So I look up and say, "Babe, I thought you were hot and wanted the fan." "I did." "Well, why is it pointing at me then?" We both got the same wide-eyed look and realized that the fan had spun 180 degrees in less than a minute by itself. It was creepy, but none of this ever felt dangerous. More like it was a man who was annoyed that my husband had moved in. I guess the ghost wanted me all to himself. We lived across the street from one of the oldest cemeteries in Southern California. It was just strange little things. We thought that maybe it was the owner's remote controls turning off our TV at one point, but then we figured out that their TV was in the opposite direction of ours, and a different brand, so yeah. I was on vacation with my parents, where my brother and I were sleeping in the same room together. It was kind of a rural area, where it gets very dark at night. We went to bed in the evening, and we were still talking in the dark about random things. Suddenly I saw a blindingly bright green flash. My brother stopped talking in the middle of his sentence because he saw it too. Both of us were quite startled, and also completely blinded for a few seconds. After confirming that we both saw the same thing, we went to wake up our parents. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to tell them other than there was a weird light. So since we didn't find anything, they just went back to bed, and my brother and I didn't fall asleep too well that night. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I thought it could have been the headlight of a car, but we don't remember hearing an engine, and it only happened once over the course of 3 weeks, so that seems unlikely. We still tell this story to people. Sometimes, and usually, they don't believe it, or chalk it up to the wild imagination of children. But we were 15 at the time. It didn't quite make me believe in ghosts, but to us it was a pretty spooky experience. I was in a burial site on a tour. The area was large and empty, in a field. I was standing quietly looking around when I heard something whispering in my ear. Then it moved to my other ear. I wish I could tell you what. It was a set of breathy whispered syllables that rushed back and forth with a staticky element between my ears. Being that this was a potter's field of mental institution patients from the 1800s, it makes me wonder what the spirit was trying to convey. The whispering swiped back and forth almost like a train barreling down the tracks, but just between my ears. It was definitely a woman. I seriously couldn't make out the words, and I tried to shake my head of it, until I noticed that the person near me had a look on their face that made me realize he heard exactly what I had too. We looked at one another wide-eyed and exchanged the exact same account of what had happened. Maybe if I'd have experienced this by myself, I would have come up with an excuse. But as it was also confirmed by another person, I knew it was real. My Uncle Bill died when I was 4. He and I were incredibly close. He was my favorite, and I was his. I lived in Colorado, but we went down to Alabama for his funeral. I'm 31 now, so I don't remember him actually visiting me. But I do remember telling my mum, "Mum, Uncle Bill says it's gonna snow." My mum calmly reminded me that Uncle Bill was gone, and we were in Alabama in 1995. It doesn't snow here. Uncle Bill and I got the last laugh when we woke up the next day and it was snowing in Alabama. Very lightly, but it was there. I had a few strange things happen at a house I lived in when I was a teenager. Stuff would fly off my desk when I was in bed. When getting stuff from the basement, I would almost always get physically ill stepping in one hallway on the basement, and then when moving out, my family was in another room. A painting flew across the room and landed in the middle of it. After moving out, I brought it up with my mum, that I also used to see dark figures dart around the corners. She gasped and mentioned to me that my dad had told her that he had seen dark figures too. These all happened at the same house, which was an old farmhouse that was also a part of the Underground Railroad. We no longer live there. The house isn't there anymore. It's a very expensive neighborhood. My parents said they were sitting on the couch watching TV. The fireplace shutter opened and closed several times of its own accord, which scared them. On another occasion, my mum was sitting in the same living room. Towards her front was a large wooden deck that had a fireplace in the center and 2 large windows on either side. To the right was a concrete porch that ran the length of the side of the house. It had a door off the side that had several large windows on it as well. To her back was a bedroom that us kids shared in the winter because it was easier to heat half the house. To her left was the blue room. The whole thing was blue, but it was just a central room where our computer happened to be and had access to the basement. On the wooden deck, my mum saw a black figure. It was tall as a bear, but too thin to be human. She said she looked at it and had a feeling that it was watching her. It wasn't completely dark outside, but it was on its way. The figure then started doing laps around the house. It would pass the windows in front of her every few seconds. This was a 2,500-ish square foot farmhouse. It was incredibly fast. We had a small family farm. Chickens, goats, pigs, quail, turkey, ducks, etc. Nothing big. We had about 30 chickens at the time. Living that far out in the country, we always set up traps by the coop to catch opossums and raccoons. Anything that ate chickens. Well, we go outside one day and see piles of feathers throughout the yard and around the coop. Every single pile had a head on top of it. 30-ish piles. And that many heads. No piles of blood. No insides anywhere. Just piles of feathers and heads. As you can imagine, that in particular we found quite disturbing. Shortly after this, my dad, would go out at night with a shotgun to see if we could find anything. We had gotten more chickens and had nothing unusual in the traps, just cages. My dad was a manly man who wasn't afraid of anything. I've seen him move a tree by himself out the road that 4 grown men weren't able to together. He's tough to say the least. So he goes out like he usually does. Our chicken coop sits about 50-ish feet in front of our garage. It was really just an 1,000 square foot ranch outbuilding. We just called it the garage. So we hear 5 blasts from the shotgun very shortly after. My dad comes through the front door with tears running down his face. He is visibly shaking. After he calms down a bit, he explains that while in front of the garage he heard a real guttural growl coming from the tree line right behind him above the garage. He says it wasn't like anything he heard before in his life, as he was an avid hunter growing up. He's heard and probably eaten just about any animal that Indiana has to offer. He said it was low and demonic, and he could feel that it was evil. So he immediately unloaded the shotgun for good measure and ran to the house. At another point, I would hear voices in the house. One night I woke up my parents crying to let them know that the devil wanted my soul and wouldn't stop trying to get me to give it to him. I don't remember much about it because I was in 5th grade. I'm 31 now and have since been diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. I can see that this might have just been my anxiety, but I definitely remember sitting on the living room floor and sobbing at 3 a.m., just begging for the voices to stop. I haven't heard anything else since, and nothing like this has ever happened to me again. There's also the time my parents found a tunnel in our basement that we assumed was part of the Underground Railroad. My cousin was over at the time and asked if we could explore it. It was covered up, about shoulder height to an adult, and an adult could crawl through with not a whole lot of extra room. He had a flashlight and was gone for about a half hour. We started getting very worried when we would see the light again. He came back and said that there had not been an end in sight, but they were getting nervous having crawled so far. They were probably 16. We always had dogs, and we would find our dogs in front of the house just dead. No wounds, prior symptoms, just dead. Sometimes 3 at a time. My dad, on his way home from work, saw a pile of dead dogs in our field by our house, probably about 5 feet tall. No joke. Have you ever seen a ton of freaking dogs? Unless a local vet with loads of dead dogs decided to just launch them into our field. How the hell did they get there? My 2 brothers and I were in the house, and things started to fall off the walls. We ran outside into the field in front of our house and looking across the street to the other cornfields. There were hundreds of deer just running. It filled the field for several minutes. Enough disruption caused by them made it look like we were experiencing a small earthquake. After we moved out, we found out that there was a practicing coven that met not far from our house, and we heard a lot of dead animal remains had been found. A decent amount of years later, I went with my sister to Chicago. Her fiancé had graduated boot camp and was going to A school. They do a ceremony thing for the family with their group flag and such. They hang out for a bit and then they leave for A school. On the way home, I was asleep in the car and my sister had gotten lost. I shot up out of sleeping and told my sister to pull over. She did, and I told her to turn. She asked me what's wrong, and I said that I woke up because we were by our old house. I could feel it. She made a turn, and we passed the front gates of a cemetery that was right by the house. Had she kept by that direction, she would have passed right by it. What was at the start of all of this was a dream that my sister had. I think we had some dogs die before this point, but we didn't find out about the coven until several years after we moved. I didn't find out about the dream until I was in high school. Surrounding the end of the property, there was a tree line that separated where the coven met and our house. My sister said that in her dream, there were monsters tearing down the tree line, and that she knew if they tore it down, they were coming for me. Like, me. Not my sister or any other of the 5 people in my family. Me specifically. But not long after, in preparation of turning the property into a subdivision, they tore down the tree line. All of the stuff happened. My parents decided one day that enough was enough. We were moving, and we had a house purchase on contract and were completely moved out in 2 weeks' time. And now I bring you to the Pied de Resistance. I was in Boy Scouts, and it was the time of year for popcorn. I sold enough popcorn to be the top in the state. That's what my parents told me, at least. I just knocked on doors and pushed the popcorn. My parents had just loaded up the van with all the popcorn we were going to deliver for the following morning. It was an old brown/tan Astro van, the ones with the weird curtain in the windows. This thing was completely stuffed with popcorn. We all go to sleep, and I remember being outside with my family, looking at our van on fire. The fire department came and everything. The thing burnt completely. While my dad had a Polaroid camera and took a picture. My dad takes the picture with him and shows people because it's crazy. My dad's showing a guy the picture and the dude asks him if he sees the face. My dad looks at the picture and sees a face. To summarize this, because I don't want to make up details I don't remember, things started appearing in the picture, like in the flames. It started with a face that turned into a demonic-looking Grim Reaper type of figure. Then people started to notice more things as my dad showed it to others. My dad would hand the picture around and ask people what they saw. Everyone saw it. Then people noticed that the figure was holding what appeared to be a chain attached to a torn-apart dog, and a burning cross behind it. As soon as people started seeing that, my dad stuffed the picture in a Bible. It was a Bible that had a built-in zipper, and he didn't tell any of us about him stuffing it in a Bible until after we moved. He pulls out the Bible while we're moving, and the picture is simply gone. He was really freaked out. I remember my dad always handling the picture with people, and then being creeped out, and I remember seeing the fire. I saw the picture once right after he'd taken it, and I remember playing on the burnt-up van because it was late in the 90s and we were kids. The rest of it is what my parents have talked about. My dad was a server at the same restaurant for about 25 years, so he showed it to a ton of people. This wasn't just a few buddies. He literally began handing it out to customers. Everyone saw the same thing. This is everything I can remember. I tried to be as detailed as I could, and I'm aware that some of it isn't very believable, but it's true. The address of the house was 18401 SR 238 Fortville, IN. I don't remember the zip code. The house is no longer there, and it's now a subdivision of houses that are 750k plus houses. They didn't end up tearing it down until after we'd been gone 4 to 5 years, but that's just a guess. We have a ghost at work. We've never named him, but my co-workers and I all agree he's an older guy between the age of 60 to 70. He does things like move small items the kids wouldn't be able to reach, like on a waist-high counter. Call your name quietly, and a few times we've heard a cry, or seen a child-sized figure run past when everyone is in the garden asleep, or in their eyesight. I say hello in the morning when I get in. He seems pretty harmless and kind of protective over the children. Can't hurt to be polite though, right? The house I grew up in as a kid. The previous owners that died were an older woman with a piano. There were several times I'd wake up to a piano playing. I'd walk around the house and everything would be off and everyone asleep. She seemed to really like playing Moonlight Sonata. When I was 15, in honors chorus, I was about to go on stage and sing in front of an auditorium full of people. We were all backstage warming up, and another teenager starts playing Moonlight Sonata on piano. It's at that point I almost crapped myself. I still did my solo, but hearing that really unnerved me for days. At that point it had been a 10-year gap since hearing the song. My parents were not into classical piano, so an auditory hallucination would have been almost impossible. It happened on and off for almost a year, and it was different songs, but Moonlight Sonata was certainly the most frequently played. I know exactly who in my family is walking around based on their footsteps, but one night, pretty late, I heard someone walking down the hallway outside my bedroom with slow, heavy footsteps that definitely didn't belong to anyone in my household. Of course, no one was there. I heard this for the next few nights, and there was a couple of months break before I heard it again, and then nothing for ages. Myself and my younger brother were the only ones who had heard creepy footsteps. Recently, everyone but my dad went away for the weekend, and the first night he had to get up with a baseball bat because he thought someone had broken into the house and was creeping down the hallway, but once again no one was there. It only happened in the hallway for some reason. Starts at the end of the hall and stops at the end. I found an old headstone on our property as a kid. That same night, I saw two ladies watching me through our family room window. We locked eyes, and as we did so they turned into mist and were gone. I wasn't immediately scared either, like they were good spirits and I knew it. But it still creeps me out to this day though. My office was in the basement of a building next to an 150-year-old cemetery. The job involved handling old historic materials. On several occasions, my co-workers and I experienced unexplainable phenomena. Co-workers saw the air rippling behind my desk. Another co-worker quit after seeing a shadowy figure stalk them at night when nobody else should have been in the building. Objects have moved on their own. And once, two people swear they saw a pen levitating in the air for a split second. I was skeptical until late one night. I was leaving, and just a step behind the other person who was in the office. Suddenly I see a foggy apparition about 5 or 6 feet, standing about 30 to 40 feet in front of me. It had had a rough outline of a human. The air had turned unbearably cold, and the hair on my neck went straight up, and just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Later that night, several terrible events happened around me and to loved ones, and I knew, whatever it was not happy that I saw it. I used to see ghosts outside my apartment complex all the time. To give you a bit of context, they would be outside dressed in 50s-style clothing. They would be driving up in old cars, go through gates and then vanish into thin air. There were also two guys packing up old pickup with camping gear. They would just be outside and suddenly disappear. I wanted to record it once, but when I got my phone out, they were already gone. I know this is a very convenient thing to say, but it's honestly a true account of what happened. I encountered the ghost of a little girl once. She was in my parents' old house, which is where I grew up as a teenager. I heard a clear voice wake me up from my sleep a few times saying, "Hello?" I was never afraid, and I've never thought much about it until it happened a few times. Then one night, she laughed 2 distinct syllables. Heh. I felt bad for her, honestly. Both my ghost and yours. Imagine being a kid, trapped, on the other side of a place you know, unable to do anything about it. You're alone. No one can meaningfully interact with you. And worst of all, are all the other things that occasionally wander this side of reality with you. It's got to be terrifying. When my wife was 1, she gently touched a picture of her deceased grandfather, who she would not have known anything about at that point, as no one had explained death to her yet, and they didn't talk about death and deceased family members in the family. And she said that she'd met him before she was born, and that he was nice to her. He is the person she was named for, and that incident made me feel really happy. Whenever anyone asks what happens to you when you die, my answer is now, I have no idea. But it's the same place you were in before you were born. When she was 2, she was talking to someone, apparently a little boy that wasn't there. When I asked her about her imaginary friend, she solemnly told me that he lived in our house a long time ago. I asked no further questions, but about a year later, after we had moved out, our neighbor caught his kid talking to an imaginary friend. When we asked him, he was told that the boy she was playing with was my daughter's friend. At least, if it was, the ghost was friendly.
We joke about the little girl that lives in our house. My wife insists that she was a victim of a fire in the schoolhouse in the 1870s that was on our property before the house was built. We've never seen her, but there is the occasional door locked or unlocked, or the errant attic light on and off and so forth. Not a presence that's very strong nor overbearing. This was one time, though, when my wife was in the kitchen, and I was coming down the stairs and we both heard, "You're a good little girl, Dottie," coming from the living room. Dottie is our dog. Trouble, but a good girl to be sure. Apparently there's one more person in the house besides my wife and I who agrees. For context, we live in an ancient coastal New England town, halfway between the sites of the massacre of the Nagargarsets and the site of the Pequots. So although there are probably countless ghosts of native folks throughout our land, we are not apt to listen to them. The girl in our house is probably just one of the settlers in our town, of one of their descendants. My mum thought she saw a ghost. She went outside around 10 p.m. for a cig years ago and saw a very elderly woman walking up to our neighbours' back stairs to their veranda. Mum says she wanted to ask if she was alright, as it was very rare for our neighbours to have visitors that late. They were also elderly, but Mum said she completely lost her voice and felt stunned, though she couldn't look away. She ended up getting out a "hello," and the woman just disappeared. The next morning, Mum made a joke to our neighbours asking why she wasn't invited over for their nightcap with their visitor, and they very casually replied, "Oh, so you've seen our ghost too?" They were excited over it and not remotely scared. Barry, the neighbour, says an elderly lady follows his wife, Elwyn, everywhere, and they feel pure comfort around her. But their own children and grandchildren are frightened by the lady on the stairs when they stay.
I've always thought ghosts were fake. My mum always got aggressively religious when I'd say something about ghosts in the house. But one time in the summer she went to visit Mexico with her family, and my brother and father were the only ones left at home. I made some macaroni and served my dad a plate, as he asked. I sat on the couch with my brother and watched him play Call of Duty. When my dad came home, he sat down to eat. He said the plate was moving by itself. Of course, me and my brother didn't believe him, as he often exaggerates situations, but he claimed more than once that the plate was moving. Me and my brother denied this, but curiously, after a while, my brother got up to see what he was talking about, and he jumped back and told me that the plate did in fact move. When I got up and saw it moving, back and forth, along the round table edges, I immediately started praying. My dad called out the names of my brother and uncle, Pat and Reuben, who have passed away recently, and had told us afterwards that, like him, Reuben loved mac and cheese. When the plate stopped moving, I grabbed a knife and started circling the plate. There were no strings attached. I had lifted the plate and there was no water under it either. It couldn't have slipped or had a pressure change that would have moved the plate. I've always doubted religion, but whatever it was moving that plate absolutely dipped after praying. I still don't have enough faith in religion now, but everyone always requests more information whenever I tell them the story that the ghost tried to steal my dad's macaroni. I was around 15 to 16 in the middle of the day, and I saw a guy crossing the street in a sprint, and a school bus ran him over and never stopped. It was like I was the only one who says the bus ran over the man, and when I looked back, to my horror, there was nothing on the floor. The bus driver didn't even attempt to stop as the man sprinting across the street for the bus ran him over, like there was nothing on the road, and kept on going. I was in the backseat behind my mum. While she was driving, I asked her if she saw the bus run over the man, and she said she didn't see any man. I'm 18 now, and still can't explain what I saw that day. And it was then that I began to believe in ghosts. My partner and I were sitting in bed. The room is dim but not pitch, and there's a mirror hanging on the closet door to our right. Like if I turn my head, I see myself. We were watching TV, when I see something huge and black glide by the mirror, kind of like No-Face from Spirited Away but without the adorable mask. I thought to myself, as paranormal things aren't uncommon for me, okay, just gonna let that one go. Did I even really see that? Am I hallucinating? I didn't say anything out loud, but my partner says, "Did you just see something weird go by the mirror?" And they described exactly what I saw. When I was living in college, my roommate and I started hearing tapping coming from inside the walls behind our closet in our dorms. It was always around 3 a.m, and it got worse, and hangers in the closet began to move. The worst was when we thought inviting a friend to sleep with us in the room would make it stop. That night, with 3 people in the room, a book literally fell off the shelf. A hat also fell off the desk with no wind. You'd think it stopped with someone random in the room, but it actually got worse. Supposedly 20 years earlier, someone hung themselves in the closet in the same dorm we were living in. I had never experienced anything paranormal to that extent, but it was all the proof I needed that there was indeed something out there. My great-grandma died in '92. My auntie got the phone call that night. The next morning, my then 3-year-old cousin came out of her room and sleepily mentioned, "Mama, Grandma Rose," as in the one who just died, "visited me last night. She said to tell you that her hip doesn't hurt anymore." I used to work in a bar that wasn't exactly a jail, but temporarily held people awaiting court and sentencing. Everyone had a story about that place, who they called Sebastian. Another thing to note is it used to be a holding jail a long time ago too, but had since been converted into a bar. The first time I saw Sebastian, I looked down the stairs while I was opening, and saw some legs in black pants and smart shoes. The ceiling obscured his torso upwards, and when I went downstairs to ask how he got in, he ran down the hall and vanished. A few other members of staff mentioned seeing a man in a black suit who would be in the bar after hours while you'd be cleaning, but when you'd approach to speak to him, he'd turn the corner and disappear. Sometimes after closing, you'd hear someone ringing the bells on staff members' bikes downstairs, or you'd hear a crash and the bikes would be moved to a different place. Other times you'd see a man in black duck into the office, and by the time you'd enter, he'd be gone. The clincher that convinced us all was that it was just a thing we all believed because we all joked about it so often. One day, the new chef came. They didn't speak much English and would leave once dinner service was over, so they never engaged in the Sebastian stories. One day, one of them asked about a man in black who kept leaning on the ordering window while they were cleaning. Sebastian was pretty chill though. He never scared us or did anything mean. I think he just liked hanging out. When I was a toddler, I got slapped on the back by something. I've never screamed so loud. My parents looked back, and there was a big red handprint on my back. They think it was something that my aunt saw, which appeared, allegedly, like an old woman wearing a cloak, but had a tail dragging behind her, walking from their room to the bathroom. I'll never know for sure, but it definitely freaked the family out. In order to tell you this story, I have to go back many years before it. My grandma bought a house in Salt Lake City in a suburb in the 1960s, after her and my grandpa had their first child together, and she believes the home had been haunted since day one. She says that even though it was clear early on that something was in the house, she never felt that she needed to leave. She said it was her home now, and that whoever was there was welcome to stay as long as they understood and appreciated the rules. Other than one story, it appears that all ghostly residents at Grandma's house followed the rules and never gave her a reason to evict them. Over the years, Grandma welcomed more children to the home, and it became a safe haven for my entire family. The home is a one-story home with a downstairs living area. The upstairs has a living room, bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. The kitchen leads to a set of stairs leading to the basement with 3 or 4 rooms. We use the home for most family gatherings, and many of us have used it as a temporary residence once or twice. Much of the family has experienced something unusual in the home, and it's commonly blamed on the ghosts. 2 of my grandma's stories are the reason that I have one of my own. My grandpa died in 1999. Several months after his death, my grandma was in her kitchen doing the dishes. She felt a strange feeling come over her, like she needed to leave the house. She later attributed the feeling to my grandpa warning her of danger. Before she could even finish her thought, she had a sensation that something very strong was grabbing her from behind and trying to force her downstairs. She couldn't see anyone, but she felt something powerful try to force her. She states she fought the power very hard and managed to make it to her kitchen table. She sat at the table and held onto it, while this violent entity pulled and groped her, but she would not let go. Finally it stopped and no one was there. The house was again silent and peaceful. She said she'd never been so scared in all her life. My grandma is a tough old lady, but you could tell this really shook her deeply. While telling me this story at the same kitchen table, she told me of a little ghost girl that lives in her basement, or she may not. She said the little girl likes to play pranks on people, like pulling the blankets off while people are sleeping, or hiding things in the house. Grandma says she knew it was the girl because of the laughter. She would giggle mischievously, so she knew it was her. She seemed peaceful, and like she just wanted someone to play with. One day my mom was doing laundry downstairs while she was living there during her separation from my dad, and she says that she saw what appeared to be the hazy outline of a tiny person. She says that she said hello with a nervous laugh, and then the haze disappeared. To this point, I had never experienced anything scary or ghostly in the home. After hearing the stories, I was creeped out, being in any room alone, but still nothing more than a spooky feeling and an embarrassing sprint up the stairs every time it happened. Again to that point now. Flash forward a few years to the exact same kitchen table, only subtract my grandma and add my mother and 2 of my friends, Brad and Ashley. We're all sitting around talking and planning out our evening. My friends and I had no money, so we settled into an evening at grandma's house with my mum. Not exactly my idea of fun. At one point we began telling ghost stories, and my mum and I decided to tell my friends about the house of horrors that we were currently sitting in. My mum told me about the little girl. She too had an experience with her, so it made sense for my mum to tell it. The girl's story was met with enjoying but disbelieving eyes, so when it was my turn to tell about Grandma's dishes incident with the little girl, I was not surprised to see the same reaction on my friends' faces. The I call BS look. Next, as if almost on cue, the cheap yet expensive-looking chandelier that hung above my grandma's table exploded. I'm not talking about a blown bulb. I'm talking about 4 light bulbs actually exploding. Glass went everywhere. After a few moments of looking around at each other, we all decided we needed to leave. After tripping all over each other in an attempt to save ourselves, we managed to make it outside safely. We all left the house within minutes. My mum went home, and my friends and I got intoxicated. The ghostly pyrotechnics were of course the talk of the evening. Even now I recall this as being the most spooked out I've ever been, as we discussed what happened with some other friends we met up with that night. I began to notice that familiar BS look on their faces, but needless to say, Brad and Ashley believed. This happened to me about 4 months back. My family decided to visit some relatives in the city. During our stay there, my brother and I played card games and stayed up late watching movies with our cousins. One night we went to grab some snacks, so me and 2 other cousins went to the kitchen while the rest stayed in the living room. While there, we heard a scream. I heard the scream of another cousin who went to sleep early, but my 2 other cousins heard the scream of a different cousin who also went to sleep early. There are 8 cousins in the house, including my brother and I, and we immediately went to the living room to see the problem. But my brother, who stayed in the living room, didn't hear anything. Even 2 of our other cousins who stayed outside didn't hear a thing. For the rest of the night we talked about ghost stories, and it turns out the house was actually haunted. In one of the rooms, if you sleep alone, you will wake up at 3 a.m. and won't be able to sleep till 4. The kitchen and balcony are allegedly the 2 ghost hotspots in this house. When I was about 12 during a summer, my sister, who's 5 years older than me, was out with friends at work. We shared a bedroom. I was up late doodling in a notebook in bed and had an older glass TV next to my bed that was turned off. At one point I looked up and saw in the reflection of the TV screen my sister walk out of the bedroom doorway and into the stairwell. When I turned to greet her, she wasn't there. I get up and walked into the stairwell, and all of the lights are still off downstairs and in the bathroom next to our bedroom. So I think she must have ran downstairs really fast and head down myself to find no one. At this point I'm getting a little spooked and wanted to prove myself wrong, so I went outside and her car was still gone. I sprint back inside and run back upstairs to my parents' room and wake my mom to tell her I was pretty sure I had just seen a ghost. She was too tired to do much for it, so I went back to my bedroom petrified. When I thought back on it, I realized the girl I saw was wearing a long-sleeved dress that looked somewhat vintage, and my sister was very much a tomboy in those days, but she had blonde hair like my sister and was looking towards me while walking out of the room. I stayed awake with my light on until my actual sister got home, and I felt safe to fall asleep. It still creeps me out, but I do think about it from time to time. I don't really believe much in an afterlife, but I know I saw a young girl walking out the door. I wasn't tired. I hadn't been watching anything earlier in the evening to scare me, and even further wasn't scared when I first saw her because I thought it was just my sister. I can't explain it though, and I never saw her or anything like it again. Close to a year ago, a friend and I went to a local cemetery. We hadn't been there in 12 years, and nothing paranormal had ever happened. Well, this time something did. My friend and I decided to go ghost hunting and exploring in a cemetery in a town that I used to live in. We were bored and thought we'd go after midnight, because they say it's the witching hour. We went into the cemetery and fell very heavily in there, but the moon was out and gave illumination since we didn't have flashlights. We started walking on the path, attempting to stay away from the graves as we wanted to be respectful of the dead. It started feeling weird at times, like being watched, also seeing shadows moving and getting feelings of goosebumps. My friend said he saw what looked like a winged, shadowy thing descend into the sky, and we kept hearing the crunching of leaves and unintelligible talking or whispering. We tried walking into one area but got this weird feeling of dread or something lurking that wanted to be ambushed. So we noped out of there and went into a different path in the cemetery. But then the mood vanished behind the clouds and it got darker. We'd been there for maybe 45 minutes, and then this feeling of dread crept up on us, and we slowly made our way towards the exit. Mind you, my friend was walking much faster than me, and was slightly ahead, and I was maybe halfway near the exit when I felt something hit me on the left, near the back of the ear. It felt like a round object. When it happened, I yelled at my friend. I explained that as a kid I hated when some kid in class would hit me in the back of the head with objects, and it used to really get on my nerves. At first I thought he threw something at me, to be funny, even though why he would do it wasn't exactly very justifiable. He said he hadn't, plus he was ahead of me, so it wouldn't have been possible. We ran out into the car and drove somewhere where we could discuss what happened and what we saw in the cemetery. To this day, we're not entirely sure what occurred. We've tried to debunk it, but cannot find any rational logic for what happened to me. For like a month, I felt like a totally different person and didn't have any paranormal things happen to me at all. My grandmother passed away from cancer 2 years before I was born, and my grandfather had a room where he kept all her things such as jewellery, pictures, her china and crystal collections, etc. I moved abroad at quite a young age, but would stay with my grandfather when he visited, and my brother and I would often be given her room to sleep in during our visit. It's hard to explain really, but I always felt there was something lightly off in that room. I didn't mind sleeping there, but I also didn't hang out in the room much during the day, even when I was much younger. Before we moved abroad, the room wasn't one I would play in. I always played in the room directly next to it. Fast forward to when I was 10 years old and visiting my grandpa, staying in the room as normal. The room was super dark at night, and my grandpa had these super blackout blinds to let no light in. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I could see this floating figure at the end of my bed. What I saw I can only describe as this very white glowing thing. As I said, there was no light in this room at night, but this thing was bright white. It looked like it was draped in this white see-through stuff, which floated as if in the wind, blowing inside the room. It stood there for a moment. It wasn't terrifying at all. The thing is, it was almost calming for a 10-year-old to see something like that. But it did freak me out, and I hid under the covers until I passed out from exhaustion. I still think about it from time to time. Like I said, I don't know what I saw. I like to think it was my grandmother since it was her room, but who knows? I've never really been able to rationalize what I saw. But I haven't slept or spent more than 5 minutes in that room since. And it has been 17 years. What I'm about to tell you took place when I was 11 years old. I'm currently 48, but the memory never faded. At the time, my 2 older brothers shared a room together, and I shared not only a bedroom with my older sister, but the bed as well. I was the baby. One night I awoke suddenly to the street lamp, red alarm clock, digits glaring at me in the eye. 2:58 a.m. As my eyes began to adjust to the darkened room, I noticed the pale blue moonlight streaming through the windows, landing across the foot of the bed. As I continued to survey the room, my eyes fully adjusted. Movement caught my attention. I quickly pulled my feet up to my legs, as I felt someone sitting down towards the bottom of my side of the bed. I have a hard time believing what I saw that night, even to this day, but here it goes. At the foot of my bed was this thing, with legs, arms, and a body that was oddly shaped, distorted-like, as if they were trying to transform into something else. The figure was dark, but not so dark that I couldn't make out its facial features. Eyes, or should I say where the eyes should be. There were 2 round, even darker holes. It felt as if I were looking into the depths of 2 deep wells. The nose was elongated and wide, with a pronounced hump at the center of it. The mouth appeared to be nothing more than a slit. Even though I was focused on the basic nothingness of the face, I could tell the body was still shifting, still moving, as if trying to find a form. I tightly closed my eyes, hoping that what I was seeing was a mere trick of the light. But no, it was still there. I began gently kicking up my sister and quietly saying her name, scared that this thing at the end of my bed would hear me or see what I was doing. Then I heard it, a low guttural laugh. I could feel my body tense even more, fear rushing through my veins. I closed my eyes as tightly as I could again, but this time when I opened them, the thing had moved closer to me. It felt like my heart dropped deep within my stomach, and I immediately became nauseous. I could hear something coming from its direction, but I couldn't make out what it was. Again I heard this thing begin to laugh, or more so giggling this time, as I shut my eyes out of pure terror from the sound, not realizing I had done so. I really wish I hadn't done that. I began kicking my sister much harder now and saying her name aloud. My eyes still shut tight. I could hear that sound again. It was closer now and resembled something of a low rumble, or a hum. Terrified to open my eyes, and terrified not to, I decided to open them. What I saw will forever be imprinted in my brain.
It was so close to me that I could reach out and touch it. The slit for a mouth was now trembling like an earthworm wiggling through the ground. I watched in horror as its hollow eyes grew rounder and began to take over its face. The trembling mouth, as well as beginning to grow larger. It was at this point that I finally realized what the sound was. The distorted body wasn't distorted at all. It was a horde of rats scurrying on top of each other, on top of that thing. The holes in its face were growing larger because the rats were running out of them. I can't tell you for how long I was frozen with sheer fright staring at it. I began to scream at some point, which finally woke up my sister as bright lights flooded the room. She stood in the doorway with her eyes wide, hand over heart, asking me what was wrong. It was gone. I began frantically looking, my eyes bouncing in all directions, but it had left. At this point, my sister was comforting me, soothing me with, "Shh, it'll be alright, sis." And I recall falling back asleep, holding on with a death grip to my sister's arm. I'm not sure why, but my sister chose not to ask me what had frightened me so badly that night. The next morning brought sunshine and a Saturday morning, a favorite of every 11-year-old. I immediately thought of the thing that had terrorized me the night before, and after giving it some thought, I decided that it must have been a very realistic nightmare. I walked out my bedroom and started down the hall towards the TV room, when I overheard my mum speaking to someone from her bedroom. As I drew closer, I realized she was on the telephone. What I heard sent a long, cold shiver down my spine. I think it was a demon. It stood in the corner of my bedroom whispering that it was going to take my children one by one, and it had rats running all over it.
When I was 15, my dad was driving to a friend's house to practice some roller hockey. My buddy lived in a 2-story log cabin with a long, winding driveway. It was the first time I had been to his house, and I had been told by his parents that he wouldn't be home until later in the evening. As we drove up, my dad said he thought my friend's parents weren't home, so I told him they weren't. He then points to a 2nd-story window and says, "Well, someone's here." I look up and see an older male dressed in Western clothing wearing a big cowboy hat. This is Texas, so it's not that unusual. I say I guess they got home early and shrugged it all off. A while later I mentioned something about asking his parents something, and he says they won't be home till later. I point out both my dad and I saw someone in his house, and he freaks out because no one was supposed to be there. When we go into his house to check, we don't find anyone. After his parents got home, we were in a back room of the house and I see a picture of the guy who had been upstairs. I point to it, and my buddy turns white and says that was his granddad who died 6 years earlier. Turns out my buddy's parents believed their house to be haunted by multiple spirits. This story happened to me at the time when my best friend and I were volunteering to clean up a cemetery after a big storm my senior year. We were walking along, talking, picking up branches and stuff from the storm, tidying up stuff left on graves, just making an afternoon of it. And suddenly at the exact same time we both froze and turned to look at the same spot behind us. After asking each other what we heard, we confirmed that we both heard a woman's voice go, "Shh," right behind us. It wasn't like the wind in the trees. It was almost like the sound a librarian would make when you're talking 5 decibels too loud. And we both looked at the exact same spot from where it came from. There was no one there. The closest person to us was a good 50 feet away, and they'd have to yell just for us to hear them. Curious, my friend took a look at the headstone right there, and then looked at the one next to that. It was a mother, buried with her infant. We were disturbing the baby. We even apologized for being too noisy after that, and went on our way, not wanting to offend the spirits. My Chow Chow passed away in December 1999. She was almost 14 years old. One evening in the late spring of 2000, I got an unusual urge to go out onto the front porch. The porch and front of the house were brightly lit by a streetlight across the street. While standing outside, I hear a chuff 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 noise coming from the left and getting closer. This sounded exactly like the sound my chow chow would make when doing a fast walk. The sound continued approaching from the left. By now I'm looking up and down the street, in yards and over railings, trying to ascertain where the noise was coming from. There was no one in the street, no one in my yard, and no one else outside. I looked and looked but couldn't find a source, and the noise kept coming. When the sound was right in front of me, it stopped, as I felt the sudden presence of my chow chow. I broke into happy tears and enjoyed her presence and thought how much I loved her and missed her. I thought how it would be to have her back with me all the time. Something inside me told me that having a ghost, albeit a dog ghost, with me all the time may not be the best thing. So I told her I loved her but that she needed to go on with her journey and that we would be together again. The chuff 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 noise started again, moving to the right, away from the porch, and continued for a short while, getting continually fainter. I never heard the noise again, but I do believe we will be reunited one day. This occurred when I was around 2 years old. I personally have no memories of the experience, and this is mostly based on what others have told me. I was staying with my paternal grandparents, and I described to my grandmother about how an old lady with a dog sat down and read to me in her backyard. She asked what the name of the dog was, and I told her that the name was Bo. My grandmother called my mum and told her what I had said, and my mum told her that my maternal grandmother, who passed away a few years before I was born, had a dog named Bo for a while. There was absolutely no way I could have known that prior to telling my grandma, so I 100% believe that the ghost of my maternal grandmother decided to pay me a visit that day. I was probably about 20 years old, in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was a Sunday, and I just met this girl I had a super crush on at a coffee shop. We had a nice visit, and I wanted to ask her out, but I chickened out. Vancouver is a pretty busy city if you've not been there, but this day it was oddly quiet. I was walking down the street. I was at the light, waiting to cross the road. The light changed, and the little red hand turned into the "you're safe to cross" guy. At that point, I had some severe mental confusion that I'd never had before. It stopped me dead in my tracks. I had this weird little debate with myself. So in my mind I said, should I walk? I think so. The little man is walking, which means I'm safe, right? I mean, it was the hand, which means stop, and then it was not the walking guy, so does that mean I can go? I was dumbfounded. Then I debated to myself the red and green aspect and said to myself, the light was red but is now green. Green means go and the little man is going, so I should be able to go, right? Now, I am not a rule follower type, and there was almost no traffic, so I would have never had this insane debate with myself. I would have simply looked both ways and crossed the street, but instead I had this weird internal confusion. I took one step into the intersection, and a Suburban ran the red light and sped through the intersection. It was like they were being chased by cops, but there was no one. I would have been right in front of that car. Had it not been for the confusion by the lights, I'd have been 100% dead. The last story is something I swear is true. Maybe there's some other explanations. I'll let you decide. I used to deliver candy to vending machines as a job. I was on Vancouver Island, and basically, there is only one road that connects most of it. I was coming from Victoria and going up island. I was coming up the summit of the road and just short of cresting the hill when I heard this massive bang. It was the loudest bang I'd ever heard in my life, and then there was this massive cloud of dust in front of me. I naturally slowed down to a crawl. Then the dust was moving in this weird pattern, and the cloud directly in front of my vehicle was being blown across the road. It's hard to explain, but imagine a 50-foot wall of thick dust in front of you, and then the bottom 10 feet of the wall being blown across the road in front of you, while the other 40 was just kind of hanging across the air. Anyway, I was just coasting slowly, and kind of driving up to where the clouds were blowing, and another voice in my head that wasn't mine said, pretty damn loudly as well, "Shut off your engine and roll through the cloud." I almost pissed my pants. I was so shocked, but I did what the voice said. I shut it off and put it in neutral and rolled through the cloud on the other side. So what happened was a propane delivery tank had plowed into the mountainside. We found later the driver was drunk. The top of the tank, the safety valve, had been blown off, and it was propane that was blowing the dust across the road. I think the voice in my head was getting me to shut off my engine, to stop anything from igniting the propane, which obviously would have ended super badly. I didn't smell any of that propane stank, but someone later told me the sulfur scent is added later so that people can tell there's a gas leak. The whole road was shut down for a day or two after that. Anyway, to me, this was 100% real in each instance. I do not normally hear voices in my head. I have no doubt, in each of these situations I could have died. So on one hand, I feel like my life has been saved repeatedly for some reason. But on the other hand, I'm just some jerk who's not really doing anything useful with my life to warrant such intervention. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll save the world. Here's to hoping, and thanks for listening. This happened back in middle school. I received violin lessons from one of my teacher's old students. My teacher always told us to be careful and very respectful in the practice room. It was a soundproof room that we had in the band building, because that was the most haunted room. My teacher said that you didn't want to anger anything or anyone in there. While I was waiting for my violin teacher to come into the practice room, I set up a chair for me and a chair for my violin teacher and placed it side by side. I ended up practicing for a few minutes by myself, and that's when it happened. As I was playing music, the chair next to me looked as if it was being grabbed by someone, and it spun around and faced me. The chair even slid back a bit, as if someone had sat on it. Not gonna lie, I freaked out and was screaming internally, but decided to keep on playing because whatever it was wanted to watch me play. As I continued to play, my violin teacher walked in, saw my freaked out face and saw the chair facing me. He kind of smiled and said, "Oh, so it happened to you too, huh?" He just shrugged it off, grabbed a different chair and sat next to me, and we proceeded with the lesson, with the chair still facing me. I have never been so freaked out in all my life. In my current home, the common one thing we would hear is random footsteps and the sound of our upstairs hall switches flicking on and off. But the lights wouldn't turn on or off, only the sound of switches, which are unmistakable. The one that scared the living hell out of me was hearing someone upstairs banging on my door desperately at 3 a.m. I used to think my parents were the ones making the switch noises and the footsteps. My parents assumed it was either me or my sister rushing to turn off the lights to act asleep when we heard them coming upstairs. So my dad did some sneaking around when he was positive he could hear a switch sound. He came into our rooms and noticed we were snoring. I did my fair share of investigation too, and found out it wasn't by any of us. Now onto the door banging situation. It was a Friday night, and I was super tired. I slept at probably 9 or 10 p.m. and woke up briefly at 3 a.m. to check on my phone. Then I heard it. A loud, bang-like thing on my door for about 3 seconds. I felt the vibration on my bed. I tried to make sense of it. My dad has a habit of banging doors when we lock them, but I flashed my phone light at it and it was unlocked. Plus my dad would yell our names, and I didn't hear anything. I was 20 and scared to death, and hid under my blanket and slept after some time. At lunch I asked if anyone did that / heard anything, to which everyone denied. It's definitely not wind, since we closed our windows, and it wasn't a windy day to begin with. Plus I experienced what wind can do, and this was different. Other than that, it's just the sound switch, and maybe the laundry basket moving a few times, but nothing physical happened, and I'm not particularly bothered by it. The days when I used to play with the man in the closet.
They go back to a time where everything was unclear, yet out of all the things to remember, that man has always been in my memories. Always has, and always will be. My first encounter with this man I remember clear as day. My family had just moved into a house in the States. It was my first time being in the States, and I was 5 years old. And for some strange reason, I was excited more than anything. My little brother was running around the house. I called him, and he came over to me. I asked him if he wanted to play a game, and we decided to play hide and seek. And he went to hide while I counted to 20. When I got done counting, I went to look for him. I couldn't find him, so I started yelling, "Raymond, where are you?" I went to the very top of the house, the 3rd floor, and I thought to look in the closet. He wasn't there, but I did find something. A door. There was a door inside the closet. For some reason I thought to open it. I was only 5 and curiosity got the best of me, so I opened the door, and inside it was nothing more than an empty room, except for a desk, a man, and his typewriter. I walked up to him and asked, "Why are you in my house?" He looked at me surprised as he couldn't believe I'd found this room. He just said, "Jose, you're not supposed to be in here." I asked him who he was, and his only response was, "Jose, shouldn't you be looking for your brother? I bet he's worried about you." I looked at him, and he looked back, and I remember that he seemed quite average. Nothing about him was strange other than the fact that he was wearing all white. He held my hand and told me that I should keep looking for my brother. He opened the door and closed it behind me. I didn't think much of it, as I was only 5, so I went looking for my brother and found him in the kitchen under the sink. I never told him about the man in the closet, mostly because I wanted the man in the closet to be my friend, not his. My little brother did not know about this man till I was about 12, and he 11. Anyway, that was the first time I met him, although it was not the last. I remember there were 2 other occasions. The second time I met him I remember quite clearly. I remember it because my mother was fighting with my stepdad. I couldn't leave the house, so I hid inside the closet. Just so I wouldn't have to hear them, you see. My little brother was at my aunt's house, and my only guess is that they forgot I was in the house at all. It had been weeks, and I had tried to visit the man in the closet, but time after time I would look and the door wouldn't be there. But this time was different. This time he opened the door and I saw the light from the floor. He told me to get inside quick and I did. I have no idea how long I was in there for, and for some strange reason I trusted him. I never questioned how he knew my name without telling him. I never asked him for his. Maybe I did. Perhaps it's one of the few things I don't remember of him. The only somewhat personal thing I know about this man is that he was from Germany. After talking for what felt like hours, he told me it was fine to leave. He held my hand and opened the door. "Everything's going to be fine, Jose. It might look like it's always going to be like this, but don't worry. Keep your chin up, okay?" As soon as he led me out, he closed the door behind me, and when I looked back, the door was gone. I walked out of my closet, and it turns out I was in the closet for almost 3 hours, and my mother had been looking for me. I told her I'd been in the closet the whole time, but she said she'd already looked in there, and I wasn't. To this day, she still thinks I lied about it to her. Days passed by, and I tried to see him again. I went to the closet to see if he was there almost every day from the day I saw him to the last. The door behind the closet just seemed to never show up anymore, until the very last day at the house when we were moving. My little brother was downstairs with my mother and I just wanted to check one last time. I told my mum that I'd be back. I'd left a toy in my room, and I went to my room and checked the closet. I saw the door behind the clothes in the closet, so I went to open it, and when I walked in he was typing away on his typewriter. I asked him why he hadn't been around, and he just looked at me with a face that said, "It hurts inside." I looked at him and said, "I thought you were going to be here for me." He kept looking right back at me with a face and just said, "I'm sorry." He didn't have to say anything, but he did stand up and uttered a few words. It wasn't in English. In fact, if I really think about it, it probably was German. Then he held out his hand and walked me out the room. When I finally got out the closet, my mum had gone crazy looking for me. Turns out I was in that closet for a long time, at least 2 hours, and my mum was on the verge of calling the cops. I remember it clearly, like the other times, except this time was different. This time was the last time I saw him. The man in the closet, the man in all white. The man, for whatever reason, I could only see. I wish I could find out who he was. I still think about him every now and then, mostly because deep down in my heart, no matter how hard I try to deny it, I know this man was real. Even now, I just get goosebumps, because maybe he's still watching me. I think he knows I'm still here. That's what really gets to me.
One of the popular means of transportation in my city is the subway, but the stations are quite old, so many of them don't have escalators or elevators. Because of this, often enough, I help old people with their groceries or parents with their strollers climbing up and down the stairs. One of these times I was helping an old lady carry her stroller down the train platform, and there was this clerk cleaning the platform with one of those big sweeper things that you push around. You know, they're slow and heavy. He was short and about 60, with hair missing from the top of his head, wearing big glasses. After I helped the lady, I leaned against the wall and started scrolling through my phone. The man reaches my position on the platform, and from where he was, he said, "Thank you for helping that woman." I raised my head from my phone and we both smile. Then he says, "You're an angel." And I smile back, not really knowing what to say. Kind of embarrassed, I looked back at my phone and immediately get the idea to thank him and tell him that what he did made me feel good. However, when I looked up, moments later there was no one to be found, nor the machine he was operating. The doors where the subway clerks store their equipment at the end of the platform, and we were nowhere close to them, as we were in the middle. I have no idea where he could have gone. No more than 3 to 4 seconds had passed between our exchange and me looking up. I never told anyone this story because it's kind of self-centered and hard to believe. People can dismiss it and say that I just wasn't paying enough attention, but there was legitimately nowhere for him to go without making a sound like that. My bedroom is on the 2nd story. The stairs are to the right of my bedroom and bathroom door. It started out like a normal dream. At the time I thought the whole ordeal was real. I came downstairs when I heard my mum come home from work. She set a cute-looking porcelain doll with wavy brown hair and a frilly white dress on the counter, and said she went by the thrift store to pick it up. "Oh, sweet," I say, and I inspected it. Mum walked down the hallway to her room, and I carried the doll back upstairs with me. I set the doll on my nightstand, and as I'm just getting laid down under the covers, I hear my mum screaming, "No, don't take it upstairs!" Then there's banging on the walls. At that moment I'm rigid, staring at the ceiling. Nausea sets in, blackness, and a woman with black eyes and rotting flesh appears above me, hands gripping and pushing my shoulders down, and I can taste salt and blood. Her open, screaming mouth is dripping, cold splashes on my face. My ears are assaulted with the worst scream I've ever heard, just blood-curdling sobs. It was so anguished, I just can't move, staring up at this woman who's still just grasping at my neck. I soon realize it's a dream, and honest to God, all I can think about is, I can't believe my brain is doing this. Her image becomes hazy, and I start to come to. It's only about 5 a.m. when I wake up. I expect it to be 3 a.m. I'm surprised it didn't terrify me as much as it should have. I'm just a really jumpy person. So a couple of minutes after reviewing this, and I get sick. I've seen this woman before. I certainly believe in the paranormal, but I'm not horrified by ghosts. My experience has taught me that whatever you're dealing with is dead and gone, and simply doesn't have the willpower to hurt you. In the aforementioned hallway downstairs, there's a bathroom on the right. There's a curtain that blocks the rest of the continuing hallway. I must have been about 13 to 14, but I was really into the paranormal. The hallway and bathroom lights were off, and the atmosphere felt right enough to do a little Bloody Mary game. My parents were right outside on the porch, so I felt ballsy enough to try it. I leaned into the bathroom and said the chant and ran out of the bathroom, past the curtain and into the continuing hallway. Now, I can't explain this, but I've mentally checked it over and over. The curtain seemed to lift away from the ground, and a woman with long greasy hair, empty eye sockets and a lipless grin slowly leaned out the bathroom door. And I kid you not, I kicked her, but heard nothing. I can't describe how the thing vanished, and I booked it past the hallway outside my parents' room. I was getting chills, and I never told anyone about what I saw. I just didn't want to think about it this time. I've since been baptized, and I'm hoping that no more spooky ghosts will choose to attach themselves to me. This happened about 2 years ago, but it still sends chills down my spine whenever I think of it. There's a local factory that was made in 1890, and it opened in 1891 as a sewing factory where people handcrafted detachable collars and cuffs. In 1999, it was repurposed as a bunch of little consignment shops throughout the whole building in each room. Today, there is still the original huge elevator shaft with rickety gated doors. One night, me and my friend decided to go and check out one of the bookshops that just opened up there. We headed downstairs, went and left the store, and eventually took a break on one of the benches before leaving. To our knowledge, no one else was in the building, or at least in the basement with us. So we're sitting there, and the way the bench is positioned is flat up against the wall, where you can see all the way up the hallway, with the flight of stairs to our right, and one of the shops to our left. While we're sitting there and talking, I started feeling this uncomfortable feeling, and tried telling my friend I wanted to leave to hurry up, because I just didn't like this feeling. He told me to calm down, and that we'd leave in a minute, and the uncomfortable feeling went away. As we were about to get up and go, we saw someone come around the corner and start approaching us. We figured it was the maintenance worker, but that feeling of uncomfortableness came over me again. Yet, worse this time. Now the way he turned the corner was completely unnatural. He walked to the end of the hallway, stared at the wall in front of him for a solid 5 seconds, and then turned towards us and took a brief pause before coming our way. The way he turned the corner though, it seemed as if he knew we were there and was completely unfazed when he saw us. I would say that's plausible, but we were being fairly quiet and the hallway was a solid 30 to 40 feet long, so we'd have to be talking decently loud for him to hear us. I went into panic mode, but my friend kept their cool. The place was still open. We weren't breaking any rules, just sitting on this bench. My friend calmly looked at him and said, "Hi, how you doing?" And the man didn't say anything. He just kept walking towards us at a somewhat rapid pace. I remember looking at him in the eyes. He had zero expression, not anger, not happiness, nor confusion, just nothing. It was severely unsettling. Even after my friend said something to him completely unfazed, he was just on a mission to get us. You'd assume if this was a maintenance worker, he'd either tell us it's time to leave or say hi back or something, anything. But nope, just this blank, expressionless face making his way towards us. After he didn't respond to my friend and started getting close to us, we just gave each other this "we need to go" look and sprinted out of there. When we got out of the building and down the road, the uncomfortable feeling left me, and I started calming down. We didn't really talk about what just happened. We just went on our way back to my house. Ever since that night, I haven't been back to the factory or any of the shops there. Something about the man wasn't right, and it sent a chill down my spine seeing him, and it sends chills down my spine just typing this out. I'm a firm believer of the paranormal, and I can just about guarantee that what we saw that night wasn't human. I was at my girlfriend's parents' place with her. They live in a small town in Iceland, in the old doctor's house. It was the middle of the night and I had to get up to pee, and I had this really uncomfortable / bad feeling. when from the corner of my eye I notice a woman stare at me, wearing an old-timey dress. I turn to look in her direction, and there's nothing there, not even an old oil lamp or something. It sent chills down my spine, so I hurried back to our bedroom and asked my girlfriend, "Do you guys have any ghosts?" "Oh, yeah, my brother refuses to sleep in this room because one night he couldn't move, and when he opened his eyes he saw a face." "Was it a woman's face?" "Yeah, I think so," she replied. Apparently this woman died under the care of the good doctor, and I was not the first nor fourth to see it. She's apparently harmless, but goddamn it freaked me out. And my girlfriend was just sitting there, acting like she's the Pope's pajamas. I also think it's important to note that a number of other people had experiences in the house, including an old psychic/seer who refused to even pass the threshold into the house. I was visiting a friend in Chicago, and she told me under no uncertain terms the ghost of a woman who lived there wasn't really fond of men staying there. I was told that I needed to make sure I closed the door behind me, lest she slammed the door behind me. Sure as hell, the first night I'm there, I get up to pee in the middle of the night. I didn't close the bathroom door when I came back from the bathroom, and the door slammed so hard it knocked a piece of art off the damn wall. My friend has insisted that his parents' house was haunted for years while we were growing up. His sister told stories about a ghost that would turn her TV on at nighttime or do something like shake her bed while she was in it, but I never really believed them. One day they asked me if I would house sit for them while they were all on vacation. It's where my drum kit lived at the time, so I was always there anyway, as my friend and I were in a band together, so I didn't think anything of it and said yes. And that was when my first and only paranormal experience happened. I'll never forget it. I had slept in on a sunny day. It was around 11 in the morning, and I had nowhere to go. I was laying awake in bed in the spare bedroom upstairs, knowing full well that I was alone in there, when all of a sudden the sound of an adult man singing opera filled the entire house for about 30 seconds. It was extremely loud and unignorable, and I will never forget how scared I was. And after the singing stopped, my heart was absolutely beating out of my chest. I got dressed and sprinted out of the house as fast as I could, and didn't go back to finish my house-sitting duties after that. I figured the ghost had it handled. My parents' house has a ghost. When my sister, who's now 42, was 5, she started talking about the Green Lady. Of course, us older 3 sisters made fun of her a lot. She continued for several years talking about the Green Lady. Then one day when I was 48 in middle school, I went upstairs and heard a swooshing sound. I turned to see what it was, and there was this lady with a long green dress from like the 1800s and dark hair tied up very pretty. Then, just like that, she was gone. I never saw her again after that. But my mum took in a little boy for a while for a family that needed us when I was in high school, and he always talked to a lady upstairs when he was alone. He was only 3 when he stayed with us. Also, lots of weird things happened in my parents' house. Cupboards would open and shut on their own, and the water faucets would turn on and off by themselves. I don't know the history of our house before it was built, but it would have been newly claimed land in the 1800s. Not to mention the fact that my sister, when she was 5 or 6, shared a bedroom with me. She would wake up screaming, saying there was a dark man in our closet. My parents would have to come in to calm her down. I never saw that, but she saw the dark figure. She was petrified of the dark figure, but perfectly fine with the Green Lady. I don't tell this story often because at 48 it still sends chills down my spine. I often wonder if the dark figure in the closet isn't responsible for the death of the Green Lady. My facility is fairly new, but has plenty of quirks. 95% of the paranormal or creepy things are just normal part of the building's function.
The other 5%, though, have no explanation that I've been able to find in our 4 years of employment, and no one in maintenance or exhibits can give a good answer for either, and they've tried. It was built in a formerly economically depressed part of the city before the area was gentrified, and some of that shows through in the weirdest ways. So occasionally we get this weird cloud of odor that just pops up and sticks around for a bit and then leaves. It could be anywhere in the building at any time and lasts for any length of time. And it smells like weed. Strong weed. I thought someone had dumped their stash next to an intake vent at first. But the first time I knew something was up, I was working second shift with a co-worker at about 10:30 at night. He's on a catwalk about 80 feet above the ground and reports a smell like someone smoking had just walked past him. We followed the smell for 2 hours before it vanished. What we determined was this: a sphere odor about 2.5 to 3 feet in diameter, hovering about 5 feet in the air, was moving back and forth across the catwalk at a leisurely walking pace. Not like air currents. It was like a dude was pacing casually on a smoke break for 2 hours. We chalked it up to a ghost and left and went about our night. 14 months later, I was working alone in our command center at 4 a.m. It was the dead of night, raining outside, and there had been no one around the building since midnight. In the span of about 6 to 7 seconds, the air went from normal office smell to hotboxing with a hippie for 3 days smell. It was so strong that it made me gag, and I was legit worried about catching a high contact of it. After 2 minutes of me checking cameras and videos around any intake vents, it just disappeared. Not like the air ducts were cleaned out, or like a filter started working again, just like it showed up 3 or 4 seconds between me noticing it and was letting up, and it was totally gone. Like it had never been there. It happened a few times since then, but these are the most memorable events.
My mother opened a clothing store, and the building she and her partner rented was at one time a popular brothel. It's a beautiful building, but very haunted. One night she had closed up for the night, locked the doors, set the alarm, and went home in the evening. Then around 3 or 4 a.m. the police department called her and told her someone was in her store and had turned all the lights on, and it looked like end caps and things were turned over and items were all over the floor. The police told her that they didn't suspect anyone was in the building, and the doors were still locked. They also said, by the looks of things, it was extremely unnerving, and that it would be better if she went to check on things. So she did. When she got to the store, she went into the basement where handbags and merchandise were kept in storage. She said the door, which was locked by deadbolt, was wide open. The handbags were thrown around, and clothes were scattered all over the place. Fast forward a few months. Both my parents decided to open up a restaurant, and things get weirder. No one who owned the building prior ever mentioned any paranormal activity. But after working in the kitchen for almost 3 years, I've got a few stories that are unexplainable. On a busy Friday night in the summer last year, a stack of pizza trays flew off a rack and almost hit me in the face. I've had water pitchers thrown at me by this ghost as well, and I think that same week the fridge door opened up and a box of pork flew out maybe 4 or 5 feet onto the ground. My head chef saw this and we freaked out together. More recently, this ghost has become a fan of turning on mixing bowls and moving plates around. It hasn't thrown anything at me recently, but the one time it threw a pitcher at me, it did hit my hand. My head chef said he'd seen the ghost, and it's a woman wearing a red dress and looked like she's from the early 1900s. Sometimes at night, we will hear someone walking around after everything and everyone has left the building. At this point, it's not really scary, just a regular thing. It doesn't like women though, and it's actually pushed my general manager up against a window and held her face against it. She no longer goes into the kitchen at night. We believe this ghost is connected to the clothing store ghost and that my mother carries her spirit around. It's very odd and sometimes scary, because the ghost isn't always peaceful. Sometimes new hires get excited and agitated, in which case I get very serious and tell them to knock that out and that it's not funny. Last summer, I was helping my boyfriend clean up his house a bit. At least 2 or 3 times. I swear, I felt him stand right next to me. But he seemed to be across the room. I brushed it off. Then he was running some garbage outside to his dumpster. As I was sweeping, I took a step backwards and felt something brush against my back. So I said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you come back," as I turned around thinking I'd bumped into him. And then my boyfriend walked in through the front door in the other room. After that, he told me that his whole family had had stuff like that happen all the time, and they're pretty sure their house, which is a massive 3-story place, which is over 100 years old, has at least 3 different spiritual inhabitants, and he assumes that one got curious. My mother was involved in union affairs, so I often had to accompany her on business trips. One time, we stayed in an old tuberculosis hospital that had been converted into cheap motel/hotel suites, and, as I learnt, was awash in horrifying ghost stories. Let me paint the picture. This hotel spital was extremely conservative in its interior design. Everything seemed to be utilitarian, from the rooms having exactly 2 beds, a table, chair, and a desk and nothing else, to the bleachable plastic lino coverings on the floor, to the exposed white pipes that came through the ceiling that still had its original plaster crown molding. Along both sides of the very wide hall that composed the main building were rooms besides each other that were clearly once patient rooms. But running down the very center of this hall were its own rooms, with windowed walls and doors, leading onto this little courtyard, usually with some couches and a TV and other stuff like that. These doors could be slid open, so you could easily pass through them to the other side. You could see through the large window walls to the other rooms lining the other side of the hall, so this center boulevard of lounge areas barely felt like a room at all. The various tales surrounding this infamous long building of rooms were so. The flute-playing girl. A girl with long hair would be seen in windows on the top of roofs and in mirrors, or too far away for people to properly make out. She would play a flute in a strange, disjointed manner. Throughout the night, I realized the pipes would often make a whistling noise as water rushed through them above our heads, and wondered if that was the origin of the tale. Then there's the story of the suicide nurse, a woman who worked at the hospital and couldn't handle seeing so many deaths and hung herself. Apparently no one had any idea that she had been so badly traumatized and didn't see it coming, so it was a shock. People reported leaving at night for some reason, the bathroom, getting a snack, etc., and returning to see their beds made up. One woman I spoke to had this happen literally every night, and had assumed that it was some sort of janitor or hospitality worker that just popped in to do it quickly at 3 a.m. for some reason, and didn't think of it after that. There were no overnight staff that would do that, though. Then there was the story of the yelling group. People reported hearing loud, heated-sounding arguments between several men coming from down the hall, too far to make out the words, but definitely obvious, angry and violent sounding. People would call the front desk about and get, "Oh yeah, that's just... ignore that, it's no one," because they'd grown so used to getting the reports of the fighting noises, and the odd things would be that one room would hear it, but no other rooms on that floor ever would. And the most famous one is the "Where are you?" ghost. The hospital used to be located near a river that was frequently used by First Nation communities before it was settled by immigrants. A man was returning home by canoe, and he heard someone screaming in fear, begging for help. He began shouting, "Where are you? Who's calling?" trying to find them and help them. But it just ended slowly in screams until it was gone. Unnerved, he hurried back to his village, only to find it entirely razed to the ground. Those who were standing on the banks of the river will hear the sound of the people crying or begging for help, maybe even their name. And it has the name Ku Appel River. For those who don't speak French, it translates as the river of who is calling. I was very young, probably only 4 at the time. My family were visiting relatives in a house they were staying in temporarily.
My mother tells me the whole thing seemed very off from the get-go. The house was pretty old, though I'm not sure how old, and my grandparents must have been sensing something there from the start based on their reactions, but I'll get to that in a while. Anyway, my brothers and I were playing in the living room of the house, and apparently both my brother and I separately went to my mother and asked her about the man in the window. I vaguely remember seeing the outline of a man's shadow against the window, but I don't remember any details. I wish my memory were better, but hey, I was 4. My brother was asking, why aren't we talking to him? To give a bit of context, our family is massive. We have tons of extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, etc. So it was not uncommon for us kids to meet complete strangers at family gatherings, which is why my brothers and I were not terrified of said strange man. My mother looked in the living room and saw no one and asked my brother where the man was. Over there against the wall by the window, he replied, and pointed to an area where the man was. At this point my mother was confused and my grandmother overheard the conversation and came over to us. What is it? She asked, and my mother explained what we were saying about the man. She immediately got a bottle of anointing oil and went through the entire house praying and putting oil above every doorway. My grandfather was previously the pastor of a Methodist church, so it was a reflex action that anything even remotely like a ghost or demon had to go. I should mention here that supposedly, and I say this because I don't know if I believe it or not, the bottle of oil my grandmother has is special because, get this, it's empty. Yes, she keeps a small empty glass bottle in her purse, and apparently whenever she needs to anoint something or someone, there will be oil in it. I don't know if I believe this or not, but I digress. After the house was prayed over by them, I believe we had group prayer and we couldn't see the man anymore. Honestly, I wish my memory from the experience were better, so I could describe him to you all. However, since it was not a traumatic experience or even something my mind could comprehend at the time, I don't remember much at all. Most of the details are from what my mother told me years later.
When I was 13, I was at a church youth group sleepover that was held at our youth group's leader's house. We were going on a ski trip the next morning, but I wasn't feeling well after dinner, so decided to go to sleep early upstairs while everyone else was watching Big Mama's house downstairs. I was in a sleeping bag on the floor of one of the empty upstairs bedrooms, but it was hard for me to fall asleep because my throat was really bothering me. There was no one upstairs besides me and a baby sleeping on his own. At one point, the baby started crying. The mum/youth group leader's wife came upstairs to check on him. He stopped crying and then she went back downstairs. I remember hearing all of that happening, and also hearing laughter and sounds from the movie downstairs as well. After the youth group leader's wife went back downstairs, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I was looking around the dark, empty room when all of a sudden I see movement from the corner of my right eye, like something was moving towards me very slowly. I look to my right and see a headless figure in dark Victorian-style dress floating towards me in the dark. I remember this figure had no head, and the dress had a white collar with some sort of brooch in the middle. It had long sleeves and it was puffy from the waist down. I can still see it in my mind almost 20 years later. I was completely frozen in fear as it slowly floated towards me, and I finally got the courage to pull the sleeping bag over my head. I used to be really religious, so I just kept saying the Lord's Prayer over and over. I was like suffocating inside the sleeping bag and didn't have the courage to run downstairs. Eventually I was so tired I fell asleep with the sleeping bag still over my head, and I woke up the next morning still scared from what happened, but I never told anyone at church about this or asked the youth group leader about his house. I still can't look at dark-coloured Victorian-style dresses without remembering this traumatic experience. My sister and I were sharing a room. She is about 1.5 years younger than me. We would watch TV from our bunk beds every night. I had the top, she the bottom. My sister would also steal the remote and put on YouTube. And as some may know, YouTube stops playing after a while of inactivity. Well, one night I woke up to a voice saying, "Help me," very quietly. It was close to me. but I could tell that it was saying it to my sister below me. I always had a blanket over my head and have a little hole to breathe, so I opened my eyes under the blanket and listened. It said these words twice before it came up to my ear and whispered the same thing. I curled into the fetal position and tried to calm myself, but it got worse. For some reason that I still don't know to this day, I uncovered my head. Big mistake. The end of my bed was against the wall, which is important. Something was sitting there with long black hair, nothing but a grey face and a long white dress. I ducked my head back under the covers and cried. I tried to call out to my mum, but my voice wouldn't make a noise. I later cried myself to sleep. What's worse than that? I thought it was a nightmare. I told my mum in the morning what happened and drew a picture of her. A few years after, the topic popped up again. Somehow, something my mum never told me was that the same night she actually did hear her call out for her. When she checked, I was already asleep. I'll never forget that night. It was horrible. This happened when I was little, the summer before first grade. A few months after moving into our new house, I would complain to my parents daily about a scratching noise coming from the closet. Every night I'd hear it, and every day I would tell my parents. My mum slept with me one night and heard the scratching too. She told me years later that the night she spent in my room with me, she felt something grab at her leg, almost as if it was trying to pull her off the bed. I remember the night after she slept in my room. We had a living room slumber party. My mum attempted keeping me out of the room, so we all slept in the living room for a few days. I started to hear the scratching in the bathroom as I was brushing my teeth a few days later, and I called out to my mum that I was hearing the scratching again. She came into the room to comfort me, and we all left. We both noticed a cut on each of our feet, in the exact same position that had not been there the day before. We stayed with our grandma after that day, and moved into a new house after that, and never went back to that house. I was so young at the time I didn't really understand what was happening, but now I get it. If my mum hadn't have stayed with me in the room that night, who knows how long we would have lived there. The first story takes place a few months ago, when I was playing with my Oculus Quest 2. I live in a 2-story house, and when you come up the stairs, you enter into the main room. Next to the stairs is a wall with a door into the bathroom. The rest of the rooms are on different walls, and are bedrooms and a closet. As the main room is wide open space, it was the perfect place for me to play Quest 2. I was positioned in the center of the room, and the bathroom was to my left. Any Quest 2 owners will be familiar with the pass-through feature. For anyone unfamiliar with this feature, it basically lets you see into reality with the camera of the front of the headset. The cameras aren't in color, and the quality is a bit grainy. So I was playing Quest 2 with my stepbrother when he goes downstairs to do something. My sister is in her room and I'm completely alone in the main room. My Quest Hub virtual environment is set to pass through so that I can see the room I'm in. I was about to open a game, when out of my peripheral vision I see what appears to be a head peeking at me from around the bathroom doorway. The head appears to be white with no facial features, although I couldn't tell its color, as pass-through doesn't show color. I turned my head towards it to get a better view out of my head, but it slipped back into the bathroom. I couldn't play Quest 2 again that night. The next story is when my family was getting ready for our camping trip, and I was grabbing my bag which was next to the bathroom door. The door was to my right, and again out of my peripheral vision I saw movement in the bathroom. I turned to look at whatever created this movement, but there was nothing there. It couldn't have been a family member because they were all downstairs. So far I've seen this bathroom dweller a number of times. My only theory is that it's a ghost. My house is very old, and it would make sense if a previous resident of the house passed away and their spirit lingers for whatever reason. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, though. One night, my grandmother was driving, and she came up upon an intersection. She had the right of way, so was just going to keep driving, but suddenly, a bright white figure darted in front of her, causing her to slam on the brakes. She was shocked, and took a moment to look around for whatever did that, but nothing was there. Not a moment later, an 18-wheeler came barreling through the intersection. If whatever figure did not dart in front of my grandmother's car, she would have likely been killed instantly by this 18-wheeler. My own story is on the scarier side of the paranormal. I was about 10 years old and had just moved into a new room in the house. I was super happy to have a bigger room, but I had always avoided sleeping in it when it was a playroom for some reason. The first night I found out why. As I lay in bed that first night unable to sleep, I began to see some sort of figure standing in the corner of the room right near the light switch. It was a very vague humanoid shape, but that's all I could make out. I stared at it all night until I was finally exhausted enough to fall asleep. Over time I kept seeing the figure standing in the same spot unmoving. As time would go on, the figure became more defined. After about 3 years of seeing this figure almost nightly in my room, I was able to see it clearly. She had a very feminine figure, but was very tall. She had shoulder-length hair that was straight and fell over her face, and abnormally long arms that reached down to her knees. Her fingers were long and sharp, almost as if they were blades, and reached down to the floor. She had no color to her, just a mass of pure darkness. Most nights she would be staring into the corner, and these nights I felt fine. I felt no bad emotions coming from her at all. Some nights she would be looking at me, but I couldn't see her eyes. These nights I would feel uneasy and struggle to sleep, but nothing scary ever really happened. When I was about 16 was when things got scary and borderline violent. One night when she was facing me, I caught a glimpse of her eyes. I froze up completely. Her eyes were piercing and pure blood red. What I felt that night was pure hatred and malice towards me. This was the first time since she started appearing where I couldn't sleep, until I passed out from exhaustion. She didn't move at me at all, thankfully. After that night, things changed. The shelf in her corner would always have things moved around. Sometimes she would wake me up by throwing things from the shelf on the ground. Eventually, she even tried throwing things directly at me, but she never left her corner. One night when I was 17, I saw her move for the first time. It was one of the bad nights where she would throw things at me, and I woke up to a book hitting the wall dangerously close to me. I immediately looked up to where she would be standing and saw her slowly but surely lifting her spindly arm to point at me with her blade-like finger. The emotions I felt in that moment were all over the place: fear, anger, sadness, malice, and all sorts of negativity. It overwhelmed me to the point of passing out. When I woke up after that, it was dark, and the negativity was just as intense. That's when I noticed she had moved from the corner entirely. She was standing above me by the side of my bed. I even tried to scream and run away, to punch her, but I couldn't move. All I could do was cry. I don't remember how I got out of the situation. The next week I slept on the couch in the living room. I tried to go back to sleep in my room after a week, but she was still there. She never got that intense again after that night. Eventually, I went to college, but when I came back for home breaks, she was no longer there, and I haven't seen her since I turned 18. Let's keep it that way. I worked in a 90-year-old bookstore. 2 months into working there, the long-time owners had decided to retire, but soon after, the assistant manager chose to keep the place open despite the long-time owners having sold off 90% of the stock. The assistant manager hired family and friends and kept half of the old staff, including me. A few months in, one of the friends she hired, who ran our computers after we closed at 9 p.m, said a man would appear on the basement stairs at 10 p.m, would walk to the back of the store, climb the stairs into the loft and disappear. The assistant manager took this story with a grain of salt, as she was religious and did not believe in the paranormal. But then family she hired started staying late too, and they began seeing the guy as well. Eventually, the assistant manager stayed there late and claimed to see him as well. 6 months into the assistant manager running the place, a lady showed up with pictures of the store from the 50s, saying she'd worked there in the 60s. I asked her if she'd ever seen the ghost. "I worked for him," she told us. She explained that the ghost was the owner within the 60s. In his time, the store closed at 10, and he would go around looking for last-minute customers before heading up to the office. Meanwhile, I always had the morning shift, and I'd start coming in before sunrise because we had someone stealing all our newspapers from the front porch. I would go inside and wait in the nearby dark for the newspaper truck to drop them off. It was a few days after hearing the story about the old manager. I'd just brought the papers in and was hankering for donuts from a nearby shop. As I was about to leave, I turned back towards the darkness and said, "Go to the donut shop, want anything?" I didn't hear a voice, but the words "bear claw" popped into my head. I ran for the door, getting the creepy feeling that if I stuck around for one more second, I really would hear a voice say, "bear claw."
I've worked at a vet clinic for 4 years now. There was a clinical cat called Jingles who ended up passing overnight. It was really sad for all of us. Jingles was a real character, serious mischievous little thing. She passed December 24th, 2018. And ever since that day we've all had an experience with Jingles. I was the one working Christmas, so sadly I found her. I called my co-workers to come and say goodbye, and started filling out the cremation paperwork. I walked away from the computer for just a moment to just breathe. Came back, and there was a bunch of random letters where I was typing. Jingle was notorious for walking and laying on any keyboard that she saw in use. Always was messing up our notes. I was speechless. I didn't even want to delete the letters. A few weeks later, I'm alone taking care of the boarders for the weekend. I had these 4 small dogs who were always very good and pretty quiet, so they would bark when I came in but quieted down when they realized it's me. So I come in, they bark for a few minutes, then they calm down, and I was finishing mopping the floor around their kennels when 2 of them just go insane. They were both looking at the same area of the room, howling and barking like I've never heard them bark before. Jingles would stand right where they were, look and tease dogs. She was so unafraid of everything, it worried me sometimes. I said, "Jingles, you troublemaker, go to bed." And like 30 seconds later they stopped barking and were all totally fine. Had to be Jingles. I know these dogs well, and they are very calm for the most part. This other one is pretty funny. I smelled her ghost poop. Her poops were some of the nastiest smelling poops I've ever encountered, and I've smelled a lot of poops in my days. All I can say is her poops were foul enough to recognize. I walked into her old room where no cat had been in months to clean it for the new cat. And I was hit with her nasty poop stench. I've gone in there many times before to store things, so I know it wasn't always smelling like her poop. Even when she was alive, it didn't always smell like her poop. I had my co-workers come into the room and they agreed it was her foul poop. Jingles took a little ghost dookie. I'll end this with our new client, cat, Ramen. We constantly see him playing like there's another cat with him. He stands on his hind legs, swatting at nothing, and acts like he's pouncing on something that isn't there, stalks something that isn't there, and pretty much everything 2 cats would do together is what we see Ramen do with nothing. It's pretty interesting to watch, and we all agree Jingles is definitely still around. She knocks over alcohol bottles, squats Q-tips off the counter. Sometimes dogs on the table will have a reaction like a cat just jumped up next to them. Love you, Jingles. You're one hell of a cat.
When I was around 7, I woke up in the middle of the night because I thought I heard a loud noise in the house. I walked out of my room and glanced down the long hallway where I could see the street light shining through my window onto the kitchen floor. I rubbed my eyes, and I saw what appeared to be my younger brother standing just beyond the beam of light in the shadow. I walked towards him to see what was going on, and as I grew closer, it became more and more clear that this small boy was not my brother at all. It was super still, with its head tilted, and was just staring at me with these piercing dark eyes that I'll never forget. I ran straight into my parents' room as fast as I could, and slept on their bed that night. I never brought it up with them, and I did my best to try and forget about it. I think I almost convinced myself that I made it up in my head. Fast forward several years later, and I'm a senior in high school, hanging with my then girlfriend, my brother, and a few of his friends at our house. It was dark and storming outside, and our power had gone out. I decided to light a candle, put it in the middle of us, and we were all just laying there, talking out on the floor. Someone randomly suggested that we tell ghost stories, and immediately I thought of my encounter 10 years prior. I said, "Guys, I'm going to tell you something that I've never told a single soul. I saw something many years ago right here in this very house, and I don't care if you believe me or not. I 100% saw something right over there," pointing over to the kitchen. Before I could even start my story, my brother goes, "Wait, are you serious?" I glanced over at him, confused as to why he interrupted me. He then looked me dead in the eyes, his face distressed and turning a little white. Did you happen to see a little boy?" My jaw dropped. I was at a complete loss for words. Everyone around us immediately started freaking out too, because they instantly grasped that we had both seen the same thing, and I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. I worked in a care home, middle of the night shift. Room 24's buzzer goes off, which is weird because it was on the middle floor, and the home hadn't got enough residents at this point to fill that floor. The ground was nursing and the top was dementia, so I get sent upstairs to investigate, and I find the door locked and the alarm still ringing. So I phoned the nurse on duty and she comes up with the key, unlocked the door, and we found the room to contain the belongings of a man who died several months before, and management was storing it until the family decided to do something with it, as they were from Australia. As I went to hit the alarm button to turn it off, the nurse said loudly, "All right, Barry, we'll get you a pint, hold on." She opened a can of beer that we have for residents and left it open in the room. Didn't hear anything else from that room the rest of the time I worked there. I was at a secondary school camp. Basically, the sleeping area for guys is a fenced-in area that also served as the activity area. There's only one way in and out of the place, and there's a big street light/lamp shining down on that spot, so it's super obvious at night. What happened was I woke up needing to pee. As I walked to the porta potties, I saw an old man walking out of the sleeping area. It was late, and no one else was awake, but I saw it clearly. The old man shuffling his feet and walking out, and the lamp shone directly on him, making him super obvious. I don't think much of it, and just went to the toilet. I had forgotten about it for 2 years, when my friend, who used to be a camp counselor, told us there was a stone in the activity area that served as a tombstone for an old man that died there. I knew he wasn't lying about the stone because I remember standing on it, and then suddenly it clicked, and it made me realize I might have actually seen the old man, because there was no reason for an old man to be entering the guy's sleeping area in the first place, let alone exit it. There were actual toilets on the other side, not porta potties. I'm just glad I didn't follow the old man that night. I used to work at a casino to set up for big dinner events and exclusive parties. One night it was just me and my supervisor working that night, and I head up to the second top floor, which is a pretty nice bar area of the casino/hotel, and everyone thinks it's haunted for some reason. Naturally, I thought they were just full of crap. So I'm up there setting cocktail tables and stuff, and about halfway through I hear my supervisor's voice come from the kitchen area from behind some doors, just making casual conversation. We were pretty good friends, so he was asking me about a girl I told him I'd met the night before. We were talking for maybe 3 minutes before he suddenly stops and doesn't answer. When I ask if something happens or if he's alright, after getting no replies, I start to walk from the front of the room next to an elevator to the floor and make my way to the kitchen to see if he's alright. Once I made it to the middle of the room, I hear the elevator. There isn't supposed to be anyone else in our department working right now, and we're the only ones allowed on the floor. When the elevator stops and the doors open, my supervisor walks out and apologizes for taking so long to come up and help. I'm shocked and confused. I don't really know what to say. After a minute or two of being confused as hell, he asks me if I'm alright, and then I tell him what happened. I'm a pretty big skeptic, but he's a fully fledged believer and I'm terrified. He rushes to finish setting up for the party, and then instead of finishing the rest of the work we were supposed to that night, he tells me to go home and he left shortly after. We're still unsure what happened, or what to make of it.
In preschool, I would always hang out with a girl named Alex. She was my best friend at the time, and I would always go home and tell my mum what Alex and I did that day. But my mum got worried because I told her Alex would always wear the same clothes to school every day. At a parent-teacher conference, my mum brought in clothes for Alex, but my teacher said that they didn't have an Alex at the class, but they had noticed that I was talking to someone who wasn't there. One of the teachers told us about how there was an Alex in class last year, but she had died of cancer, if I remember correctly. A brain-related disease, and she brought out a picture of Alex, and I confirmed that was my friend that I'd been talking to. We got paranormal experts involved in everything, and they suggested that I told Alex that I couldn't play with her anymore to prevent her from getting too attached to me. So I did, and I never saw Alex again after that. Most of what I know of the story is what my parents told me, but I vividly remember Alex. It's nothing that scares me. It's pretty cool, really, that I was the one she decided to hang out with at her old preschool. I grew up with a strange mum. We don't really talk anymore. She was a paranormal investigator while I was growing up. There are loads of stories there. When I was about 3, there is video footage of me coming downstairs as angry as I could be. Not a temper tantrum, pissed. In the video, I kept yelling at my mum that they won't let me play with my toys. She tried to ask me who, and I just kept angrily yelling, telling her that they wouldn't let me play with my toys. We didn't get a cat until I was 4 before that, and there was some kind of cat creature in the house. I had seen it in my mother's closet once. Another time I remember being awoken in the middle of the night by a cat yowling in my playroom, which is the next room over, and I could see a shadow under the door before I opened it and heard a hiss. Upon opening the door, there was nothing there. As I got older, things got stranger. After my mother got back from the catfish plantation, strange things started happening. We could hear someone running up and down the stairs at night. Shoes would be thrown down the stairs, and my most vivid memory of the time was me sitting on my mum's bed. We had no pets at the time, and it was just me and her. Her bathroom was attached to their bedroom, and she was the kind of woman that had 20 almost empty bottles on the side of the tub. While watching Barney one day, it sounded as if someone had struck their arm out and just swiped all the bottles into the tub at once. My mother came around the corner yelling, "Jeremy!" It turns out Jeremy was the name of a young man who was the slave at the plantation she had visited. He had fallen off the back of a hay wagon and died. After that day, she got back in her car, drove back to the plantation, and all the strange things stopped. Also, she now believes she's an alien. So there's a whole other story there. Also, we don't speak anymore. She tried to tell my son could heal himself of hepatitis C, that his birth mum gave him. And I hung up on the crazy lady and haven't talked to her since. She also believes that the alien encryption sun god Ra is sending her messages and that we're about to move into the 4th form of being. She thinks it's her job to let people know. By now, she might be running a cult. Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
I've had a few spooky ghost stories happen to me, but my 2 favorites are these. One happened and one started at the same night. When I was a teenager in Riverside, California, my older brother and his friends used to visit the local cemeteries at night to be spooky goth kids, often picking up broken stones and messes made by jerks along the way. This particular night, it was him, my mum and me, and I think 2 of his friends. There could have been 3. I was carrying my flip phone, which had no service, that I used as a clock, but its battery had drained earlier in the day, so it was off and useless. We were walking through an older area with upright gravestones, and I walked over to a grave when my phone rang, and it lit up as though someone was calling. I stopped and pulled it out of my pocket and looked, but there was no caller ID. I walked forward and showed my mum, and it stopped, went black again, and the call died. Okay, that was weird, but whatever. We tried to move a headstone that had been knocked over, but it was far too heavy for the 5 or 6 of us to move. When we started walking back the way we came, at what I think was the same area, it happened a second time. The second time everyone was together and saw it ring twice, light up and then turn off suddenly. That same night, when we were heading to the car, I had an urge to go to the newer side of the cemetery, so I did, as I felt oddly drawn to a specific stone. This area had only flat stones, all neatly lined in rows, and when I got there I realized it was a little boy's grave, maybe 5 years old. There were one of those small oval photos on the stone so that you could see him, and it was odd, because I had bought a Beanie Baby earlier that day and had it in my shirt. I felt drawn to leave it for him, so I did. From then on, occasionally I'd be out at the thrift store or whatever, and I'd occasionally see a toy or trinket and think, I should bring that to him. So I did for years, until I moved in 2009. I would visit the grave of a child I never knew because I saw a toy he might like. Not sure why, but to me that seemed perfectly normal at the time. I still live in the neighborhood, but me and my cousin used to live in a place that's known for being haunted. The house was featured on many different ghost hunting shows. Me and my cousin, who we will call Kyle, both had encounters with ghosts there. The ghost was always a man dressed in all black, black fedora, suit, pants, black shoes, black suitcase. Kyle was with his parents at the time when he saw him. He was sitting on a cardboard box at the end of the second-story hallway. Note that you had to walk this way to get to where he was living. While he was walking with his parents down the hall, he asked them, "Who's that man?" pointing at him. His parents were confused as they couldn't see who he was pointing to. They had asked him, "What are you talking about?" Kyle kept pointing to the man. His parents just shrugged it off and said, "Honey, no one's there." My encounter with him was a bit different. We had these washer-dryers that were next to the stairs. Now, if someone was standing there, you could only really see half of their body. I was by myself at the time, but I was going down the stairs, and I could see a man standing at the washers. I could only recall seeing him from the corner of my eye, but once I blinked he was gone. I was really confused because I swore I saw someone there. A few years later I heard that Kyle saw the same man, told his parents about my encounter, and that's when I learnt that the town had to burn many dead bodies because of a plague that had rolled into town many years ago, and many of the houses, including mine, were used for burning bodies. My town is a little bit messed up. I bought a B&B built in 1850, and after we had moved in, people began to tell us it was haunted. Seems the home used to belong to a local doctor, and it was not only his home but the local hospital too. From the second night there, we started to have strange things happen. My eldest daughter has health issues, and she said someone was sitting on the edge of her bed at night. On the third night, she was brave enough to look to see who it was. A dark-haired man was sitting there, with his head in his hands. Seems our doctor was still doing rounds and was checking up on her. A few nights later, we heard heavy footsteps coming down the hall. I hid in a room and jumped as the sound was right outside the door, and while the sound continued down the hall, there was no one there. My husband left for a few months for work, and we wouldn't tell him the stories of our doctor's visits, and he was polite, but you could tell he really didn't believe us. When he returned for a visit, he was asking about the doc, and if he had really been active recently. We were walking through the halls at the time, and when we reached for a doorknob, the door slammed shut. His hand just froze mid-air, and after a few moments it swung back open until the door handle was in his palm. All the time, I let him know with a smile. The doc also loved to change the radio station and change the clocks, which was a bit of a pain, but it was his house too. One night he set off the smoke detectors in my daughter's bedroom. I went in and took it down. The alarm was still screaming in my hand, and we removed the batteries and it kept on ringing. That event was like a blur, very surreal, and I had to beat the smoke detector to 1,000 pieces before it got quiet. But the best one was to come about 6 months later. We had opened to the public and hosted a very small wedding with less than 30 people in the B&B. The reception was a success and people began to say their goodbyes while I began to clear up. I took a bunch of dishes back to the kitchen and quickly returned as none of the guests had left, and I saw a man in the adjacent room admiring a print I had hanging over the fireplace mantel, one that looked incredibly similar to the B&B with a fantastic garden. I smiled at him and told him it was one of my favorite paintings, and he returned the smile, going back to look at it. I should have known something was off. Firstly, he was wearing a very old-fashioned brown suit that was in style maybe 100 years ago but not today, right down to the pocket watch and chain and his shoes. I walked from the room past the front door into the reception, all of 15 feet. Then I turned to ask if he had enjoyed the wedding, and he was gone. The door was still locked, no footsteps were heard on the wooden floor. He had simply vanished. Our family believes in ghosts, and every time he made an appearance we would just acknowledge his visit, thank him for caring for us, etc. I still think he was just lonely, and was so happy that the house was being used and cared for again. As an adult, I haven't been the type to hype into all the woo spooky ghost stuff. That being said, my friend's mother passed away, and we were at his family's place, doing what we could, being there however we could, friend stuff. He goes on talking about how he can feel her in the house. Sometimes he can hear or smell her. We just took it as intense grieving and denial, and decided to go along with it to help him cope. During the trip down a hallway, I caught the faintest whiff of a scent. It smelled familiar to what he described his mother wearing, but we brushed it off. Hours later, after some drinking, I decided to tell him, since he was getting the feeling none of us were taking what he said seriously. He pulls me aside into a hallway and says she only shows up for family blah 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 and she trusts you. I trust you. We hug it out, he gets out some more crying and starts saying to her to leave a sign and to let me know he's serious. If the rest of the group can't take him seriously, at least I'm willing to. So give a sign. And nothing happens. Well, everyone did drink a lot, which meant, eventually, a lot of peeing. I go through the same hallway, and I feel and smell the same scent again, with a slight chill. The usual paranormal activity trope. In the restroom, I begin to take the world's best piss. Decorations you'd expect to find in the bathroom of family homes, towels, tiny soaps, a mirror, and a picture frame here and there. There's one of these oversized candles in front of me on top of the toilet tray thing. Well, that big fat candle decided to slide all the way from the center part of the toilet, all the way off and land perfectly upright in the mini wastebasket next to the toilet. I did not finish my piss. Later my friend told me, as he just had a knowing look, not even an "I told you so" look, but just like, yep, that's right, it was her.
My mom worked day shift at a hospital for a while, and she would leave before 7 a.m, so my sister and I would take turns lying with the dog when she'd leave, because he couldn't be shut in her room alone. Anyway, my mum and I would often feel a small animal, specifically a cat, walking on the mattress near our legs and curl up next to us. We didn't have cats at that point. Nothing was ever on the bed when we'd check. One day my sister and I were talking with Mum in her room when she started banging on the side of her recliner, where she was sitting, and yelling at the dog to go away. She crawled out from the other side of the bed. When she went to extend the leg rest of the recliner, a shadow darted out from underneath and zipped across the room. We all saw it. We think it was one of our late cats who died around Halloween 2005, because he was very close to her before my younger sister and I were born.
This was back when I was still a churchgoer. My mum, little brother and I would sit close together. It was a small church with a big congregation, so we had to huddle up a bit. My brother was sitting between me and my mum, and he was kind of squished up at the time. About halfway through the sermon, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Distinctly a hand, a soft pressure on the back of my shoulder, and a slightly harder pressure curling into my collarbone. It was a really gentle feeling. It felt like any other time a person would put their hand on your shoulder to comfort you. So anyway, I turned to see who it was. And then, when I looked, the feeling faded. Not lifted like the hand moved. The sensation just kind of melted away as if it had never been there to begin with. When I looked up, I saw my mum looking back at me. She looked kind of shocked. She had felt the same thing. We both looked down at my brother, whose arms physically couldn't have moved that far without us knowing. We acknowledged it in the car on the way home, but never really spoke about it again. My uncle, my mum's brother, died in a car accident when I was about 12, and I was about 14 to 15 at the time, and still recovering from the extended trauma of everything. 22 now, it still happens every now and again. I'll just feel the gentle pressure on my arm, or my back, and it freaks me out for a second. If any doctors are here, I'd love for you to tell me that I have some rare nerve disorder or something, but that's the closest I have to a ghost story. When I was in high school, I worked at a spiritual retreat center that was also a convent. It was an old historical building that everyone said was haunted. I had the following experiences there. 1. I was doing dishes with a co-worker, and we got to talking about the place being haunted. At one point I said, "How would we even know if this place is haunted?" At that moment, the heavy wooden door that was always open slammed shut behind me. I looked around and there weren't any windows open. The maintenance guys that were sometimes around there weren't, and somehow the doorstop that kept the door open was several feet away. 2. There were several times when I would be running the dishwasher, and a co-worker would leave the room/floor to get dishes from the other rooms. I would see them back out of the corner of my eye and call to them. Then no one would be there. 3. On Sunday nights we worked alone. My first Sunday working alone, I was bringing the kitchen laundry to the laundry room, which always made me feel uneasy when I walked by, and I started hearing a knocking sound. As I walked into the laundry room, the knocking got more frequent. It was loud as well. It just kept going, so I thought there was a machine on or something leaking, or maybe a branch banging on the outside door to the room. So I checked everything out, then opened the back door, and that's when it stopped. There weren't any branches, and the door opened into this area that was closed off, so it's not like someone could have been knocking. I was so scared that I didn't work Sunday nights anymore after that. Years ago when I was a kid, my next door neighbor Lila, a sweet old lady who loved doing crosswalks for kids going to school, came over one morning and asked my mum if everything was okay and if she wanted to talk. My mum was confused and asked why she would randomly assume something was wrong. Apparently, Leela had been looking out of her back window pretty late into the night and saw my mum leaning on the fence in an old-looking white dress just staring into the darkness of the woods behind our house for a good while. Only my mum didn't own any white dresses, and she wasn't outside the night before. It still creeps me out to this day. I have a story that happened around 15 years ago. I'm 40 now, a native from Beaver Lake, Cree Nation, number 131, Northern Alberta. During the winter months, the reserve has round dances. Once summer has gone, and all the powwows are done, fall comes in, followed by Old Man Winter. It's about late October now. There was a round dance going on. Pretty much everyone goes from different reserves around the province. Drummers, singers, dancers, 50-50s, and prizes and giveaways at the end of the night. Usually by 4 a.m. it's all over. I had decided not to go. I always go, but I was on a 4:20 mission this night. It was getting dark. I had borrowed my cousin's bike to do this mission, since I was living with them, after I had a falling out with my estranged family. I don't have anything to do with them to this day, still, some 15 years later. I also need to say that it is true. Natives have medicine that can summon or bring creatures from another realm. The natives have a word for this. I don't know what it is, nor how it's spelled. But from my understanding, this little man or creature is called an up-chi-nis, meaning little man or being. So I was sitting on the deck of my uncle's home. You see, I was making my way home, and I just happened to look to my right, where my other uncle's house was. I can't explain the reason why I looked, but I did, which I instantly regretted doing, since I had seen an up-chi-nes years before. They only come around when you're doing bad things apparently, such as drinking, smoking, or drugs, or just being an overall complete arse and making life hard. Needless to say, I pedaled harder and faster. It was hard though. My cousin's bike was one of those Harley bikes with the big wheels built like a Harley but with pedals. If you have strong legs, it's not a problem. And I got scared because of my own experience with this little man creature. Some stories depict it as a 3-foot tall, sometimes solid black mass, other times describing it with little horns on its forehead, like a satyr. I made it home, but did not tell even my uncle or the family that I lived with. We call him Napiyu. In Cree, it means the man. My uncle is a medicine man. He taught me how to do it as well. The next day I asked around with my cousins to see if they were home, and I got a response that made me feel pale and weak at the knees. No one was home, telling me that all of them went to the round dance the night before. After this I explained what I saw, mistaking an up-chi-nes for my little cousin. I don't know what became of it, but to watch him jump off the rail to the deck and into the house with no lights or nothing was enough to make me go home so fast. What went on in that house I still don't know, but I'm guessing something bad. I know this since my other uncle was not a medicine man, but very mischievous, and would leave you with his kids while he and his wife would go off gallivanting, basically having a great time at my expense. I'm married now. It's been 14 years, and I'm happy. I haven't seen the creature again. At the old house we used to live in, we believed there was a little ghost boy who lived there as well. My family had seen him a few times in the backyard wearing blue mesh shorts, an orange shirt, and the sneaker sandal things with black and green outlines. He would sometimes run around and play, but there was one time that he really scared my mum. She was home alone when my siblings and I were at school, and my dad was at work. It was around 1, so she had about an hour left before she had to pick me and my sister up from school. She finished making the food in the kitchen and made sure to turn off and unplug everything she used. She went to her room to take a shower, and out of nowhere the blender turned on by itself. As you can imagine, she got super scared and went back to the kitchen to turn it off. She scolded the little boy and told him that he was welcome in the house, but he couldn't be scaring her like that. Luckily, that was the first and only incident that he ever pulled. This happened a little while ago. I was just walking up the stairs in my house when I heard a noise. Then it became more clear. There was a little girl laughing in my parents' bedroom. I shrieked and almost fell backwards down the stairs, and I know it was a ghost because no kids were playing outside and my siblings were in the basement. Try and explain that away, please. I was staying at this huge house to watch a family friend's dog while they were out of town. The woman's husband died a few years back from cancer, and all of his stuff was stored in the guest room closet when I was sleeping. One night I was completely asleep, and I woke up to the sound of something falling. I flicked on the light and realized a movie had fallen out of the TV stand. That wouldn't be that weird, except the TV stand where the movies were stored had doors, and the doors had these latches that you'd have to pull decently hard to open. I decided to be brave and go figure out what happened, and when I picked the movie, I kid you not, it was Ghost. It was probably something between 12 to 3 a.m., but I got out of the house as fast as I could. Also, the dog wasn't in the room with me, as the door was closed and locked. At a pub I used to work at, we'd always hear a load of thumping around in one corner upstairs. After a few weeks, we found a room that had been sealed over. After some research, it turned out the original landlord had hung himself in that room, but boot scuffs on the wall suggested he'd changed his mind halfway through, explaining all the flailing banging sounds that we'd been hearing.
About a week and a half ago, I was stopping by my house with a friend to pick up something I had forgotten. It was pretty late on a Saturday night, maybe 11 p.m., and while we were driving away, my friend looked towards my bedroom window and then turned to me to ask, "When did you get a white cat?" I don't own a white cat. The only cat that he could have seen was my cat who lives in my bedroom, but he's completely black. As soon as I told my friend that we don't have a white cat, he began to get freaked out and told me he saw a white cat in my window. Later, when we were in my room again, I wanted some clarification on this. White cat? Because I was having trouble believing him, and I asked my friend, could it have been a cow outline, maybe the curtain? And he replied, no, because I made eye contact and it was watching us drive away. My friend's hesitancy to even go back to my house provided for some convincing, along with the fact that he seemed to have made eye contact with the thing. I later spoke to my mom about the incident, and she appeared to have a decently thorough explanation. My black cat used to have a brother who died about a year ago from kidney failure. While this cat was still alive, he took care of my black cat, treated him as how a brother should treat a younger, weird runt of a sibling. Also, this cat was primarily white. He had a white coat with some black splotches on his back, solid black paws, and a spotch of black on his face. As my mum's explanation went, my cat was probably visiting his older brother, and that's the cat my friend saw. However, my friend said that the cat he saw didn't have black spots on its face, so he either just didn't see it, or the cat didn't have it. Another experience related to this is one night when my girlfriend was over, she exclaimed to have felt something at the foot of the bed. She explained this to me the following morning so that I wouldn't freak out, because she knew this whole ghost cat thing was sketching me out. But anyway, she described that it felt like a cat was curled up at the foot of the bed, at the corner, which wouldn't normally be weird because that's where my cat normally sleeps, except that my cat was next to us, not at the foot of the bed. She said that her foot bumped into a spot that felt like there was pressure, as if something was sitting there. She tested it again by lifting the blanket with her foot to see if she could move it from where this thing happened to be sitting, but something was holding the blanket down. At that point she got freaked out. So yeah, there's my long story about our ghost cat visitations. It's not necessarily scary, but nevertheless, it's an experience that takes a lot of courage to believe. I think a cat was haunting our old place. I never owned the cat that's haunting us. My mailman has seen it as well as other neighbors, and he commented on what a gorgeous big marmalade cat we had that he saw at the window when he dropped off the mail, and wanted to know if said kitty was a boy, because he had a girl getting fixed soon and was considering having a litter before the procedure. We told him we have a tuxedo kitty and a tortoiseshell kitty, no large marmalade. I think we hurt his feelings and he thought we were lying. He wasn't the same to us after that. My neighbors have complimented the big bright orange cat in the window. We know the previous owners never had cats, only dogs. My brother lives in another town, and when visiting him I actually saw the damn thing and thought it was real. I saw it and my first logical thought was, hey, where the hell is the litter box? If he has a cat, he'd have one, and food. I was convinced his carpets were going to go to crap and mentioned that when he came out the shower. He looked at me like I had 3 heads. I found out later from a girl who stayed that she saw it once as well. So did it follow me from my home to my brother's? We have no info on the people who lived there previously. No one in my family has ever owned a cat like that, and I only saw it the once, but people still see it on occasion. Oh, and having crazy tortoise shells, we have no clue if the live kitties interact with the dead kitties, because they are notoriously nuts. My mum used to take in strays and try to find homes for them, but it got pretty out of hand at one point. The neighbor's dog, who was always outside and no one took care of, spread fleas to my mum's dog, which infected all the cats she was caring for. It was so bad and overwhelmed the cats that they never wanted to be on the floor, despite the fact that she had been trying desperately to get the problem under control. One night, one of the cats must have been sitting on the top of the kitchen cabinets and jumped down, somehow turning on the stove and causing the kitchen to catch fire. My mum almost died, and none of the cats survived. So last night, after I put the kids to bed, I went downstairs to smoke a cig in the kitchen. I swear I could hear a cat grooming itself and walking on the hardwood floor. I called to my cat and shook the chain on the laser pointer as he loves that thing, but nothing. I brushed it off until I kept hearing it. Finally, before I went back to bed, I called my cat one more time and could hear his bell jingling as he ran down the stairs. It freaked me out a little bit, and certainly was weird.
My friends and I went out to a cemetery that was quite popular in our college town, and I met one ghost called Lizzie that they had already met. She could sort of share her feelings with us, if that makes sense. When she was introducing herself to me, I started crying out of nowhere. That same night I was hugged by a 5 to 6-year-old boy named James. He was shy but just sitting on my knees in the field next to the cemetery, where he was playing, telling me about myself and how I wanted to be a teacher. I also told him if I could give him a hug, and as I stood up to leave, I felt what could have been 2 small arms wrapping around my legs. When we left, my friend blasted the train horn he had on his truck. I just got the feeling that James was following us a little ways away and was laughing happily because he liked the horn on the truck. When I was 10, I was in bed with my back to the door and suddenly felt something standing in my bedroom staring at my back. I'd never felt scared in that room before, but in that moment there was no doubt something was in there with me. I was frozen in sheer terror and couldn't move. Dead silence. Just me and whatever it was, and after a few minutes I screamed bloody murder for my dad, who came running into the room. As soon as he opened the door, he asked me, "What was that?" Every once in a while, one of us would bring it up. It never happened after that. This one is a little banal, but it is just as real. A few years ago, I moved into a 4-bedroom home. One of the bedrooms always had a vibe to it, nothing bad, just definitely a sad place. The rest of the house was fine, but me and one of the kids stayed out of that room whenever possible. When she was about 8, out of the blue she asked me who died in the room. I told her it felt like a dog, and she said, "I was thinking that. Somebody loved him." I also want to add that my dad had the house blessed by a priest around then. I can't recall if he did it before or after, but the point is, the blessing didn't take.
This happened when I was around 8 years old. When I was young, I always wanted to do whatever my sister was doing. Therefore, when her friends at the time brought over her new Ouija board, of course I was playing it with them. I can remember this night so vividly. My sister, her friend and I were in our family room sitting on the floor, while our mum sat at the kitchen table playing a game on the computer, but was still playing with us. A little backstory. My parents were both Christian, but didn't think a board game purchased from Toys R Us could be harmful. My mum and dad just had our house built a few years before, and we were the first to live here. However, there is nothing but woods in our backyard, which made it feel pretty creepy to play in front of a window that faced the woods. Anyhow, we played with this board for about an hour, asking it simple questions and getting simple responses. That is when my sister's friend asked if the spirit would give us a sign. The board said no. She then asked again if the spirit would give us a sign, and 10 seconds later, we all heard it. This evil growl came from thin air. It sounded like something was sitting in front of us. I still remember it to this day, because it was so loud and clear. It was not an animal sound, and most definitely didn't come from the woods. I remember that sinister feeling that immediately filled the air, and we all started freaking the hell out and running around the house. I begged my mum to call a priest, and I can remember the look on my mum's face like she knew it was real, but didn't want to scare us any further. She couldn't explain it. We were terrified. My sister and I shared a room, and we were all so scared to sleep at night that my dad would sleep on the floor so that we could rest. We weren't to leave each other alone. We even stayed in the bathroom while each other showered, because that experience haunted us. Now that I'm 23 years old and a psychology major, I have become somewhat skeptical towards paranormal activity. But when I think back to that piercing growl, I cannot find any other plausible explanation for what we heard. My mum passed about 5 years ago, and I wish I could ask her about it now, but I'm certain she would vouch for it. My sister and I also talk about it from time to time, but always get such an eerie feeling when explaining it. I'd like to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. 3 years ago, I went on a residential trip to Castleton as part of the NCS. I applied to take part in it after I finished senior school. It was an amazing experience, and by far the best month of my life. Me and all of my friends were there, and I'd met this boy that I liked at the time. We spent a lot of time getting to know each other, and eventually we decided to go off in the forest on the last night in the residential. We go off walking about and decide to sit down at what I can only explain to be a fence step. A step to get from one side of the fence to another. We sat on one step each while facing opposite each other. I was facing the forest and he was facing the plain field behind me. For some reason we got an eerie feeling as we were alone, and he started talking about his grandmother's death and had a tear in his eye. All of a sudden, I noticed this 7-foot figure behind the trees clasping onto the thick and tall tree trunk whilst peering around and staring at me and this boy. I looked in utter shock, as did he, and we both saw it at the same time. I can only explain that it was a 7-foot tall man that was in perfect physical proportion for his size. He appeared see-through, but white and cloudy in the shape of a man, like a shadow, but in like a vape cloud color. And although he had no features and expressions, we both saw him stare at us. When he realized we had seen him, he began to run to the right of me before compacting himself into a orb and zooming out of the forest. The next day, one of the other girls who believed in all the supernaturalistic things had come up to me and asked if I saw something, to which I replied yes, only for her to say, "Yeah, I saw an apparition of a man that was see-through and had white cloud shadow on Monday. He was in front of this forest when I saw him from my window." This was by far the most amazing experience in my life, and I know exactly what I saw. I remember it like it was yesterday. I did try to do some research to see if it was true, but I could not find any evidence of this place being haunted. Still to this day, just thinking about it makes me shiver.